Welcome, dear listener, to this peaceful journey through time, where we will drift together across the vast and endless grasslands of ancient Mongolia, a land where the wind whispers softly through the tall grasses and the sky stretches endlessly above rolling hills that seem to go on forever and ever into the distant horizon. Tonight we will explore the gentle beginnings of what would become one of history's most remarkable empires, but we will do so in the most soothing way possible, focusing on the quiet moments, the peaceful daily life, and the slow natural progression of events that unfolded across these serene steppes many centuries ago. Imagine, if you will, the vast Mongolian plateau, a land of incredible beauty and tranquility, where the grass grows tall and green during the brief summer months, swaying gently in the constant breeze that flows across the open spaces like a soft, invisible river. This is a land where time moves differently, where the seasons change slowly and predictably, where the rhythm of life follows the ancient patterns established by countless generations of nomadic peoples who have called this place home for thousands and thousands of years. The steppes stretch endlessly in every direction, creating a sense of infinite space and freedom that is both humbling and deeply peaceful. Here the sky dominates everything, vast and blue during the day, filled with slow-moving clouds that cast gentle shadows across the grasslands below, and at night becoming a brilliant canopy of stars that shine with a clarity and brightness that is almost impossible to imagine in our modern world. The air is clean and fresh, carrying the sweet scent of grass and wildflowers, and the only sounds are the soft rustling of the wind through the vegetation and the distant calls of birds soaring high overhead. In this peaceful landscape, nomadic tribes have lived for countless generations, following the ancient rhythms of the seasons as they move their herds of horses, sheep, goats, and cattle from one grazing area to another in an endless cycle that has continued unchanged for thousands of years. These people live in harmony with their environment, understanding the subtle signs that tell them when it is time to move, when the grass in one area has been grazed enough and it is time to find fresh pastures for their animals. The tribes live in portable dwellings called jairs or yurts, which can be assembled and disassembled quickly and easily, allowing them to move their entire households whenever necessary. These circular tents are perfectly adapted to life on the steppes, with their low profile that allows the constant wind to flow over them without resistance, and their thick felt walls that provide warmth during the harsh winter months and coolness during the summer heat. Life moves at a gentle pace on the steppes, governed not by clocks or calendars, but by the natural rhythms of the animals and the changing seasons. The people wake with the sun and sleep when darkness falls, spending their days tending their herds, milking their animals, making cheese and other dairy products, and slowly moving across the vast grasslands in search of the best grazing areas. There is no hurry in this life, no rushing from one appointment to another, just the slow, steady progression of days and months and years that flow together like a peaceful river. The Mongol tribes of the 12th century lived this quiet, pastoral life scattered across the enormous expanse of the steppes in small family groups and clans, each following their own traditional routes and territories that had been established by their ancestors long ago. These were not aggressive, warlike people by nature, but rather practical herders who understood that survival depended on cooperation with their environment and careful management of their resources. Among these many tribes and clans, scattered across the grasslands like stars in the night sky, there lived a boy who would one day become known as Temüjin. Though at the time of his birth he was simply another child born into the hard but peaceful life of the steppes, his story begins not with drama or excitement, but with the quiet everyday events that marked the lives of all nomadic children in this vast and beautiful land. Temüjin was born sometime around the year 1162, though exact dates are difficult to determine in a culture that did not rely heavily on written records, preferring instead to preserve their history through oral traditions passed down from generation to generation around the warm fires that glowed softly inside their jairs during the long winter evenings. His father was Yusujii, a minor chief of the Kiad clan, one of many small tribal groups that roamed the steppes, living the traditional nomadic life that had sustained their people for countless centuries. The Kiad clan was neither particularly powerful nor particularly wealthy by the standards of steppe society, but they were a respected group known for their skill with horses and their ability to find the best grazing grounds for their herds. Like all Mongol clans, they moved seasonally across their traditional territory, following routes that had been established by their ancestors and modified over the generations as conditions changed and new opportunities arose. Yusujii was a man who understood the importance of building alliances and maintaining peaceful relationships with neighboring clans, knowing that survival on the steppes often depended on the willingness of different groups to help each other during difficult times, when harsh winters killed many animals, or when drought made grazing scarce, or when raiders from distant tribes threatened the peace of the region. It was essential to have friends and allies who could be counted upon for assistance. The boy Temüjin grew up in this world of shifting alliances and careful diplomacy, learning from an early age the skills that were essential for survival in the challenging environment of the steppes. He learned to ride horses almost before he could walk properly, spending countless hours on horseback as his family moved their herds across the grasslands, developing the intimate relationship with these magnificent animals that was so central to Mongol culture. Horses were not merely transportation for the Mongol people, but partners and companions that made their way of life possible. The hardy steppe ponies were perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of the grasslands, able to survive on the tough grasses that grew naturally on the steppes, and capable of carrying their riders for enormous distances across the challenging terrain. These horses were small but incredibly strong and enduring, with thick coats that protected them from the bitter winter cold and the ability to find food even when the ground was covered with snow. Young Temüjin spent long hours learning to care for these precious animals, understanding that his life and the life of his family depended on maintaining healthy herds of horses. He learned to recognize the signs of illness or injury in horses, how to treat minor ailments with traditional remedies, and how to select the best animals for breeding to ensure that the herd would remain strong and healthy for future generations. The education of a Mongol child was not formal in the way we might understand it today, with schools and books and structured lessons, but rather a gradual process of learning through observation and practice, absorbing the knowledge and skills that had been accumulated by their people over many centuries. Children learned by watching their parents and elders, by participating in the daily activities of clan life, and by listening to the stories and songs that preserved the history and wisdom of their culture. During the long winter months when the clan was settled in their winter camp and there was less work to be done with the herds, the evenings were filled with storytelling and music, as the older members of the clan shared their knowledge with the younger generation. These were magical times with the soft glow of the fire illuminating the faces of the listeners as ancient tales were recounted in the rhythmic, musical language of the Mongols, stories that had been passed down unchanged for generations and that connected each new generation to their ancestors and their cultural heritage. Temüjin listened to these stories with rapt attention, absorbing not only the entertainment they provided, but also the important lessons they contained about leadership, courage, loyalty, and the proper way to conduct oneself in the complex world of steppe politics. Many of these stories featured great leaders of the past, men who had united different tribes and clans under their leadership and who had achieved great things through their wisdom, their diplomatic skills, and their ability to inspire others to follow them. These stories planted seeds in the young boy's mind, giving him dreams and ambitions that reached far beyond the simple life of a herder. Though at the time these were just pleasant fantasies that helped pass the long winter evenings, he began to imagine what it might be like to be a great leader himself, to have the respect and loyalty of many people, to be able to make decisions that would affect the lives of entire tribes and clans. But these were just daydreams, and the reality of Temüjin's early life was much more mundane and practical. Each day brought the same routine tasks that occupied all Mongol children: helping to tend the animals, learning to use the tools and weapons that were essential for steppe life, practicing the skills of riding and archery that every Mongol man was expected to master, and gradually taking on more and more responsibility as he grew older and stronger. The bow was particularly important in Mongol culture, not only as a hunting weapon but also as a symbol of manhood and skill. Every Mongol man was expected to be an expert archer, able to shoot accurately from horseback while moving at full speed across the uneven terrain of the steppes. This was an incredibly difficult skill that required years of practice to master, and young Temüjin spent countless hours with his bow, shooting at targets both stationary and moving, learning to compensate for the motion of his horse and the effect of wind on his arrows. Hunting was both a practical necessity and an important source of protein for the nomadic tribes, and it was also a way for young men to prove their skill and courage to their elders. The steppes were home to many different types of game, from small animals like rabbits and marmots to larger prey like deer and wild boar, and occasionally even more dangerous animals like wolves and bears that posed a threat to the herds and had to be dealt with by skilled hunters. Temüjin proved to be naturally gifted at both riding and archery, developing skills that were exceptional even by the high standards of his people. His father Yasujiai began to take notice of his son's abilities and started to include him in more important activities, bringing him along on diplomatic missions to other clans and allowing him to participate in the discussions and negotiations that were so crucial to maintaining the complex web of relationships that held steppe society together. These experiences gave Temüjin his first real exposure to the larger world beyond his own clan, and he began to understand the intricate political relationships that existed between the many different tribal groups that shared the vast steppes. He learned that the Mongols were not a unified people, but rather a collection of many different tribes and clans, each with their own traditions, their own territories, and their own leaders, and that these groups were sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, and sometimes simply neutral neighbors who tried to avoid each other as much as possible. The political situation on the steppes was constantly changing, with alliances forming and dissolving based on practical considerations like access to grazing lands, disputes over stolen livestock, marriages between different clans, and the personal relationships between individual leaders. There was no central authority that could impose order on this complex system, and each clan had to navigate carefully to maintain their position and protect their interests. This was the world that Temüjin was learning to understand and navigate. A world where success depended not only on personal skills and courage, but also on the ability to build relationships, to negotiate effectively to keep one's word, and to understand the motivations and desires of other people. These were subtle skills that could not be learned quickly or easily, but had to be developed over many years through careful observation and practice. As Temüjin grew from childhood into adolescence, he began to show not only exceptional physical abilities but also the kind of intelligence and charisma that marked him as someone who might one day become a leader himself. He had a natural ability to understand people and situations, to see patterns and connections that others might miss. and to communicate his ideas in ways that others found compelling and convincing. His father Yasujii began to make plans for his son's future, arranging a marriage alliance with another clan that would strengthen the position of the Kiad and provide Temüjin with the kind of connections and support that would be essential for his advancement in the complex world of steppe politics. This was a normal and expected part of life for young Mongol men, as marriages were not simply personal relationships but political and economic alliances that could have far-reaching consequences for entire clans and tribes. The arrangement that Yasujii negotiated was with the Conquerat tribe, a respected group known for producing beautiful and intelligent women who made excellent wives for ambitious young men. The chosen bride was a girl named Börte, who was about the same age as Temüjin and who came from a good family within the Conquerat tribe. This was considered an excellent match that would benefit both families and strengthen the ties between their respective clans. However, as often happened in the unpredictable world of the steppes, events did not unfold as planned, and tragedy struck the family in a way that would completely change the course of Temüjin's life and set him on the path toward his extraordinary destiny. While traveling home from the negotiations with the Conquerat tribe, Yasujii was poisoned by members of a rival clan, the Tatars, who had long-standing grievances against the Kiad and who saw an opportunity to eliminate a respected enemy leader. The death of Yasujii was a devastating blow to his family and clan, not only because of the personal loss but also because of the immediate practical consequences that followed. In the harsh world of the steppes, a clan without strong leadership was vulnerable to attacks from enemies and abandonment by allies, and the Kiad quickly found themselves in a very precarious position. Many of the families that had followed Yasujii decided that it was no longer safe or profitable to remain associated with his clan, and they began to drift away, taking their herds and their loyalty with them to other leaders who could offer better protection and more promising opportunities. This was not unusual behavior in steppe society, where loyalty was often conditional and where people had to make practical decisions about their survival and the welfare of their families. Temüjin, who was still just a teenager, suddenly found himself in an almost impossible situation, trying to hold together what remained of his father's following while dealing with his own grief and the enormous challenges of leadership for which he was not yet fully prepared. The family was left with very few followers, reduced to a small group that included mainly close relatives and a few loyal retainers who were too old or too poor to have better options elsewhere. This was perhaps the most difficult period of Temüjin's early life, as he struggled to keep his reduced clan together while facing constant threats from rivals who saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential future competitor. The family was forced to live a much more precarious existence, moving frequently to avoid enemies and often going hungry when they could not find adequate grazing for their remaining animals. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, this period of adversity played a crucial role in shaping Temüjin's character and developing the skills and qualities that would later make him such an effective leader. He learned to survive in the most difficult circumstances, to make the most of limited resources, to inspire loyalty in people who had little reason to be optimistic about the future, and to never give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. During this time, Temüjin also experienced the fickle nature of steppe politics firsthand, learning valuable lessons about who could be trusted and who could not, about the importance of maintaining strong alliances, and about the need to be both generous to friends and ruthless toward enemies. These experiences taught him that survival in the world of the steppes required not only personal courage and skill but also careful planning, shrewd judgment, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The young man who emerged from this period of trials was very different from the carefree boy who had grown up in the relative security of his father's protection. But he was also stronger, wiser, and more determined than he might otherwise have become. The seeds of greatness that had been planted in his mind during those long winter evenings, listening to stories of legendary leaders, had been watered by adversity and were beginning to grow into something that would eventually reshape the entire world. The years that followed the death of Yasujii were filled with countless small struggles and quiet victories that slowly shaped the young Temüjin into the man he would eventually become. And during this time he learned the most important lessons of his life about leadership, loyalty, and the complex nature of human relationships in the harsh but beautiful world of the Mongolian steppes. These were years of gradual growth and development, when each day brought new challenges and new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the respect and trust that would be essential for any young man who hoped to rise above his circumstances and achieve something greater than the simple life of a herder. Despite the difficulties that had befallen his family after his father's death, Temüjin never forgot the marriage arrangement that Yasujii had negotiated with the Conqueror tribe. And as he grew into manhood, he began to make plans to claim his promised bride, understanding that this marriage would not only bring him personal happiness but also provide him with the political connections and support that he desperately needed to rebuild his clan's fortunes and establish himself as a leader worthy of respect among them. Many tribes that roamed the endless grasslands. The journey to claim Börte from her family was both a personal milestone and a political statement, demonstrating to the world that Temüjin was no longer a powerless orphan but a young man of substance who intended to honor the agreements made by his father and who had the strength and determination to protect what belonged to him. This was an important moment in the traditional life cycle of steppe society, when a young man proved his readiness for adult responsibilities and his ability to provide for a family of his own. Börte herself was everything that Temüjin could have hoped for in a wife, possessing not only the beauty and grace that were prized in women of the steppes, but also the intelligence, strength of character, and practical skills that would make her an invaluable partner in the challenging life that lay ahead of them. She came from a respected family within the Conqueror tribe, and her marriage to Temüjin represented a significant alliance that would benefit both clans for many years to come. The wedding ceremony itself was conducted according to the ancient traditions of the Mongol people, with elaborate rituals and celebrations that lasted for several days and nights, bringing together members of both families to witness the union and to participate in the festivities that marked this important occasion. These celebrations were not merely social events but sacred ceremonies that invoked the blessings of the eternal blue sky and the spirits of the ancestors, ensuring that the marriage would be fruitful and that the couple would prosper in their life together. The gift exchange that accompanied the wedding was particularly significant, as it established the relative status and wealth of both families and created bonds of reciprocal obligation that would influence their relationship for generations to come. Temüjin's family, despite their reduced circumstances, managed to present respectable gifts that demonstrated their continued dignity and their commitment to honoring their agreements, while Börte's family provided a generous dowry that included not only material goods but also the promise of future support and cooperation. Among the most valuable gifts that Börte brought to the marriage was a magnificent sable coat that had been in her family for many generations, a garment of such exceptional quality and beauty that it immediately established her new husband's status among the other young men of the region. This coat would later play a crucial role in Temüjin's rise to power, serving as a diplomatic gift that helped him secure the alliance of one of the most powerful leaders on the steppes. The early months of Temüjin and Börte's marriage were among the happiest of his young life, as he experienced for the first time the joy and comfort of having a true partner who shared his dreams and ambitions and who supported him through the many challenges that continued to face their small but determined clan. Börte proved to be not only a loving wife but also a wise counselor whose advice and insights helped Temüjin navigate the complex political situations that arose as he worked to rebuild his father's legacy and establish his own reputation as a leader. Together they worked to strengthen their clan's position by carefully cultivating relationships with other tribal groups, offering their services as skilled herders and warriors to more powerful leaders who could provide protection and opportunities for advancement. This was delicate work that required careful judgment and diplomacy, as they had to balance their desire for independence with their need for security and support from stronger allies. During this period, Temüjin renewed his childhood friendship with Jamukha, a young man from the Jadaran tribe who had been his closest companion during their youth and who had also grown into a charismatic leader with his own following of warriors and supporters. The reunion of these two ambitious young men created one of the most important relationships in Mongol history, though it would eventually lead to tragic consequences that neither could foresee at the time. Jamukha was in many ways similar to Temüjin, possessing the same natural leadership abilities, the same hunger for power and recognition, and the same understanding of the political dynamics that governed steppe society. The two young men formed a powerful alliance, swearing the traditional oath of blood brotherhood that made them closer than biological siblings and committing themselves to mutual support and cooperation in all their endeavors. This alliance brought immediate benefits to both men, as their combined forces made them much more formidable than either could have been alone, and their reputation began to spread throughout the region as word of their friendship and their growing power reached the ears of other tribal leaders. They complemented each other well, with Temüjin's careful strategic approach balancing Jamukha's more impulsive and aggressive tendencies, creating a partnership that seemed destined for great success. The two friends spent many months traveling together across the steppes, raiding enemy tribes, protecting merchant caravans, and gradually building their reputations as skilled warriors and effective leaders who could be trusted to deliver on their promises and who treated their followers with fairness and generosity. These were golden days for both men, filled with adventure, success, and the deep satisfaction that comes from working toward shared goals with someone who truly understands and appreciates your efforts. However, even during this period of friendship and cooperation, there were subtle signs of the tensions that would eventually drive the two men apart, as their different approaches to leadership and their competing ambitions created small but growing sources of friction between them. Jamukha was more traditional in his outlook, believing that the ancient customs and hierarchies of steppe society should be preserved and respected, while Temüjin was beginning to develop more radical ideas about merit-based leadership and the possibility of uniting all the Mongol tribes under a single ruler. These philosophical differences might have remained manageable if not for the dramatic event that would test their friendship and ultimately reveal the fundamental incompatibility of their long-term goals. This event was the kidnapping of Börte by warriors from the Merkid tribe, an act of aggression that struck at the very heart of Temüjin's personal honor and that demanded immediate and decisive response if he were to maintain his reputation and his standing among the other leaders of the steppes. The Merkid raid came without warning in the early hours of a cold morning, when most of the camp was still sleeping and the guards were drowsy from their long night watch. The attackers moved with swift efficiency, surrounding Temüjin's jars before anyone could raise an alarm and focusing their attention on capturing the valuable prize that they had come for rather than engaging in unnecessary fighting that might alert other tribes to their presence in the area. Temüjin himself barely escaped capture, fleeing into the surrounding grasslands with only a few of his most loyal followers, while the Merkid warriors seized Börte and several other women from his clan, along with a substantial number of horses and other valuable possessions. The raid was over almost before it had begun, leaving Temüjin with the agonizing choice between pursuing the raiders immediately with his small force, which would almost certainly result in his death or capture, or accepting the loss and trying to rebuild his life without the woman who had become the center of his world. For most men in his position, the practical choice would have been to accept the loss and eventually find another wife. Understanding that the Merkid tribe was far too powerful to challenge directly, and that any attempt at rescue would likely end in disaster for everyone involved. The steppes were harsh and unforgiving, and survival often required making difficult compromises and accepting painful losses rather than pursuing hopeless vendettas that could destroy entire families and clans. But Temüjin was not like most men, and the thought of abandoning Börte to her fate was completely unacceptable to him. Not only because of his love for her, but also because such a failure to protect his wife would destroy his reputation and make it impossible for him to ever again claim the respect and loyalty of other warriors. A leader who could not protect his own family could hardly be trusted to protect the families of his followers. And word of such weakness would spread quickly throughout the steppes, making it impossible to attract the kind of support that would be necessary for any future ambitions. Instead of accepting defeat, Temüjin made the bold decision to call upon his allies for help, beginning with his blood brother Jamukha and extending his appeals to other leaders who might be willing to support a rescue mission in exchange for future favors and a share of any spoils that might be recovered from the Merkid tribe. This was a risky strategy that required him to reveal his weakness and vulnerability to potential rivals. But it also demonstrated his determination and his willingness to honor his obligations regardless of the personal cost. The response to his appeals was better than he had dared to hope, as several powerful leaders agreed to contribute warriors and resources to the rescue effort, partly out of genuine sympathy for his plight, but also because they saw an opportunity to strike a blow against the Merkid tribe, which had been growing too powerful and aggressive for the comfort of its neighbors. The most important of these allies was Toghrul Khan of the Karys, a Christian tribe that controlled much of central Mongolia and whose support would be crucial for any large-scale military operation. Toghrul Khan was an experienced and respected leader who had known Temüjin's father and who remembered the friendship and loyalty that Yasujii had shown him during difficult times in the past. When Temüjin appeared before him with the precious sable coat that Börte had brought as part of her dowry, offering it as a gift in exchange for military assistance, the older man was impressed both by the young warrior's determination and by his understanding of the diplomatic protocols that governed relationships between tribal leaders. The gift of the sable coat was perfectly calculated to appeal to Toghrul Khan's sense of honor and obligation, as it demonstrated both Temüjin's respect for the Kare leader's superior status and his willingness to make significant personal sacrifices to secure the help that he needed. This was exactly the kind of gesture that carried great weight in steppe society, where personal relationships and reciprocal obligations were the foundation of all political alliances, and where a man's word and his willingness to honor his commitments were more important than any written contracts or formal agreements. With Toghrul Khan's support secured, along with the forces contributed by Jamukha and several other allied leaders, Temüjin found himself at the head of a substantial army that was more than capable of challenging the Merkid tribe and recovering his stolen wife and possessions. The campaign that followed was carefully planned and expertly executed, demonstrating the military skills and strategic thinking that would later make Temüjin one of history's greatest conquerors. The Allied forces moved swiftly and secretly across the steppes, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain and their superior horsemanship to approach the Merkid camp undetected and to launch a surprise attack that caught their enemies completely off guard. The battle was fierce but brief, as the Merkid warriors were unprepared for such a large and well-coordinated assault and were quickly overwhelmed by the superior numbers and tactical skills of their attackers. The rescue of Börte was the primary objective of the campaign, but the success of the operation brought many additional benefits that would prove crucial for Temüjin's future development as a leader. The victory over the Merkid tribe enhanced his reputation throughout the region, demonstrating that he was not a man to be trifled with, and that he possessed both the strategic intelligence and the diplomatic skills necessary to organize successful military campaigns against powerful enemies. More importantly, the campaign provided Temüjin with his first real experience of commanding a large army composed of warriors from different tribes and clans, each with their own traditions, fighting styles and expectations about leadership and the distribution of spoils. This was invaluable training for the much larger and more complex military operations that he would later undertake, teaching him how to manage the competing interests and personalities that inevitably arose when diverse groups were brought together for common purposes. The successful conclusion of the campaign also strengthened his relationships with his key allies, particularly Toghrul Khan and Jamukha, both of whom had taken significant risks to support his cause and who now had good reason to trust in his abilities and his loyalty to his friends. These relationships would continue to be important sources of support and cooperation for many years to come. Even as the political situation on the steppes continued to evolve and new challenges arose to test the strength of these alliances. Perhaps most significantly, the rescue of Börte marked a turning point in Temüjin's personal development, as it was the first time that he had successfully organized and led a major undertaking that required him to think and act on a scale much larger than the day-to-day concerns of managing a small clan. The experience taught him valuable lessons about leadership, diplomacy, and military strategy that would serve him well in the many campaigns and political struggles that lay ahead of him. The reunion with Börte was naturally a source of great personal joy and relief, but it also brought new complications and challenges that would affect Temüjin's life for many years to come. During her captivity among the Merkid, Börte had been forced to become the wife of one of her captors, and although she was quickly restored to her rightful place as Temüjin's primary wife, the question of paternity for any children that might result from her time in captivity would create ongoing uncertainties and political complications. These personal challenges were compounded by the growing tensions between Temüjin and Jamukha, as the success of the Merkid campaign had revealed fundamental differences in their approaches to leadership and their visions for the future of the Mongol tribes. While both men had benefited from the victory, they had drawn different lessons from the experience, and their friendship began to strain under the weight of their competing ambitions and incompatible philosophies. Jamukha remained committed to the traditional structures and hierarchies of steppe society, believing that the existing system of tribal rivalries and shifting alliances was the natural and proper order of things, while Temüjin was beginning to envision a radically different future in which all the Mongol tribes would be united under a single leader capable of bringing peace and prosperity to the entire region. These different visions were not immediately incompatible, but they created an underlying tension that would eventually prove impossible to resolve through compromise or negotiation. The months and years that followed the Merkid campaign were marked by gradual changes in the relationship between the two former blood brothers, as their respective followings grew and their spheres of influence began to overlap in ways that created competition and conflict rather than mutual benefit. Both men continued to treat each other with outward respect and courtesy, but underneath the surface politeness there was a growing awareness that their paths were diverging and that they were becoming rivals rather than allies. This period also saw significant growth in Temüjin's reputation and influence throughout the region, as word of his success against the Merkid tribe spread and other warriors and tribal leaders began to take notice of his potential as a rising power on the steppes. Young men who were dissatisfied with their current situations began to seek him out, offering their services in exchange for the opportunity to share in his future successes. And gradually his following grew from a small family group into a substantial force capable of independent action. The process of building this following required all of Temüjin's diplomatic and leadership skills, as he had to balance the competing interests and expectations of warriors from many different tribal backgrounds, while maintaining the loyalty and enthusiasm that would be essential for future military campaigns. This was particularly challenging because traditional steppe society was organized around kinship and tribal identity, making it difficult to create unified groups that transcended these ancient divisions and loyalties. Temüjin's solution to this challenge was to gradually develop a new model of leadership based on merit and personal loyalty, rather than tribal affiliation and hereditary status. Rewarding followers based on their contributions and abilities rather than their family connections or traditional rank within their original tribes. This was a revolutionary approach that challenged many of the fundamental assumptions of steppe society, but it proved to be extremely effective in attracting and retaining the loyalty of capable and ambitious individuals who might otherwise have been limited by the circumstances of their birth. The transformation of Temüjin from a struggling young clan leader into the figure who would eventually become known to history as Genghis Khan was not a sudden or dramatic change, but rather a gradual process that unfolded slowly over many years. Like the changing of the seasons on the vast steppes, where each day brought subtle shifts in the landscape, and the weather that were barely noticeable individually but which accumulated over time to create profound transformations in the environment around them. This peaceful evolution of leadership and influence happened through countless small decisions and quiet victories, through the patient building of relationships and the careful cultivation of trust among the many different groups of people who gradually came to see Temüjin as someone worthy of their loyalty and respect. During these formative years, as Temüjin's reputation continued to grow throughout the region and more warriors began to seek him out as a leader who could offer them opportunities for advancement and prosperity, he faced the constant challenge of managing the complex relationships and competing interests that naturally arose whenever diverse groups of people came together under a single authority. The traditional structure of steppe society made this particularly difficult, as the various tribes and clans had their own ancient customs, their own ways of doing things, and their own expectations about how leaders should behave and what benefits should flow to loyal followers. The genius of Temüjin's approach to these challenges lay in his ability to gradually introduce new ideas and methods while still respecting the fundamental values and traditions that his people held dear, creating a sense of continuity and stability even as he quietly revolutionized the way that leadership and authority functioned within his growing confederation of tribes and clans. He understood instinctively that lasting change had to come from within rather than being imposed from above, and that people would only accept new ways of doing things if they could see clearly how these changes would benefit them and their families. One of the most important innovations that Temüjin introduced during this period was his systematic approach to promoting individuals based on their abilities and achievements rather than their family connections or traditional tribal status. A practice that was almost unheard of in the hierarchical society of the steppes, where birth and kinship had always determined a person's position and prospects. This meritocratic approach attracted many talented individuals who had been frustrated by the limitations imposed by their circumstances of birth, and it also encouraged all of his followers to strive for excellence in their duties and responsibilities. The implementation of this merit-based system required great care and diplomacy, as it challenged many deeply held beliefs about the proper order of society and threatened the traditional privileges of established families and tribal elites. Temüjin managed this transition skillfully by introducing changes gradually, and by always ensuring that traditional leaders were treated with appropriate respect and given important roles that acknowledged their experience and wisdom. Even as younger and more capable individuals were given opportunities to prove themselves in positions of real responsibility. This careful balance between innovation and tradition extended to many other aspects of Temüjin's leadership, including his approach to military organization, where he began to experiment with new tactical formations and strategies while still respecting the traditional fighting methods and weapons that had served the Mongol warriors well for many generations. He recognized that the key to military success lay not only in individual courage and skill, which his people possessed in abundance, but also in coordination, discipline, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances during the chaos and confusion of battle. The development of these new military techniques was greatly aided by the practical experience that Temüjin and his followers gained through their participation in numerous small-scale conflicts and raids that were a normal part of life on the steppes, where disputes over grazing rights, stolen livestock, and questions of honor regularly led to armed confrontations between different tribal groups. These relatively minor engagements provided excellent opportunities for testing new ideas and training inexperienced warriors without the enormous risks that would be involved in larger campaigns against more powerful enemies. As Temüjin's military reputation grew and his tactical innovations proved their effectiveness in these smaller conflicts, he began to attract the attention of more powerful leaders who were interested in forming alliances with him or who saw him as a potential threat to their own positions and ambitions. This increased visibility brought both opportunities and dangers, as it opened new possibilities for advancement and expansion while also making him a target for those who preferred the existing balance of power on the steppes. The most significant of these relationships, and the one that would ultimately prove most consequential for the future of the Mongol people, was the gradual deterioration of Temüjin's friendship with Jamukha, whose own power and influence had been growing during the same period, and who was beginning to see his former blood brother as a rival rather than an ally. The two men had taken different paths in their approaches to leadership and their visions for the future. And these differences were becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile through the diplomatic courtesy and mutual respect that had characterized their relationship in earlier years. Jamukha remained firmly committed to the traditional structure of steppe society, with its emphasis on tribal identity, hereditary leadership, and the preservation of ancient customs and practices that had served the Mongol people well for countless generations. He saw himself as a defender of these time-honored traditions against the dangerous innovations and radical ideas that seemed to be driving Temüjin's approach to leadership, and he genuinely believed that his former friend was making a serious mistake by challenging the established order of things. From Jamukha's perspective, the merit-based system that Temüjin was developing was a threat to the stability and continuity of Mongol society, as it undermined the authority of established leaders and created uncertainty about traditional roles and relationships that had provided security and predictability for many generations. He worried that these changes would weaken the bonds that held tribal society together, and that they would ultimately lead to chaos and conflict rather than the unity and prosperity that Temüjin claimed to be seeking. Temüjin, for his part, had come to believe that the traditional system was holding the Mongol people back and preventing them from achieving their full potential as a unified and powerful force on the steppes. He had observed how the constant feuding and competition between different tribes and clans weakened everyone and made them vulnerable to external threats. And he had begun to envision a different kind of society where all Mongols would work together toward common goals rather than wasting their energy on internal conflicts and petty rivalries. difference. These fundamental philosophical differences might have remained manageable if not for the practical competition that developed between the two leaders as their respective followings grew and their spheres of influence began to overlap in the same regions of the steppes. Both men were attracting ambitious young warriors who were looking for opportunities to advance their fortunes. And inevitably, there were individuals who found themselves choosing between the two leaders, creating a dynamic of competition and rivalry that made peaceful coexistence increasingly difficult. The situation was further complicated by the traditional expectations of steppe society regarding leadership and authority, which held that a true leader should be acknowledged as supreme within his sphere of influence and that the existence of competing authorities within the same region was inherently unstable and unacceptable. This cultural framework made it almost impossible for Temüjin and Jamukha to continue their friendship while both were growing in power and influence, as their respective followers expected them to assert their dominance and eliminate potential rivals. The final break between the two former friends came not through any single dramatic event, but rather through a series of small incidents and misunderstandings that gradually eroded the trust and respect that had once bound them together. Disputes arose over the division of spoils from joint military campaigns. Disagreements developed about the treatment of prisoners and the terms of alliances with other tribal groups. And increasingly their followers began to view each other with suspicion and hostility rather than the cooperation and mutual support that had characterized their earlier relationship. The transformation of their friendship into open rivalry was a source of genuine sadness for both men, as they had shared many adventures and successes during their youth and had developed a deep personal bond that transcended the political calculations that eventually drove them apart. Even after they became enemies, there remained elements of respect and understanding between them that reflected their shared background and their recognition of each other's abilities and achievements. The conflict that eventually erupted between Temüjin and Jamukha was conducted according to the traditional rules and customs that governed warfare between Mongol tribes, with both leaders making formal declarations of their intentions and giving their enemy opportunities to avoid bloodshed through negotiation and compromise. These formalities reflected the underlying civility that still existed between them despite their political differences, and they also served practical purposes by establishing clear rules of engagement that would limit the scope and destructiveness of their conflict. The actual fighting that took place was characterized more by maneuvering and positioning than by large-scale battles, as both leaders understood that their long-term success depended on preserving their forces and avoiding the kind of devastating losses that could cripple their ability to continue the campaign. The steppes were vast enough to allow for extended periods of movement and counter-movement as each side sought to gain strategic advantages while avoiding direct confrontation except under the most favorable circumstances. During this period of conflict, Temüjin demonstrated many of the qualities that would later make him such an effective military leader on a much larger scale, including his ability to maintain the morale and discipline of his followers during difficult and uncertain times, his skill at gathering intelligence about enemy movements and intentions, and his talent for forming temporary alliances with other tribal leaders who could provide crucial support at critical moments in the campaign. Perhaps most importantly, the conflict with Jamukha provided Temüjin with valuable experience in managing the complex logistics of keeping a large military force supplied and mobile across the challenging terrain of the steppes, where success depended not only on tactical skill and individual courage, but also on the ability to coordinate the movements of thousands of horses and warriors. while maintaining communication and control over widely dispersed units operating across enormous distances. The resolution of the conflict came not through a decisive military victory by either side, but rather through the gradual recognition by increasing numbers of tribal leaders and ordinary warriors that Temujin's vision for the future of the Mongol people offered more promise and opportunity than the traditional approach represented by Jamukha. This shift in opinion happened slowly and quietly, as individuals and small groups made personal decisions about which leader they wanted to follow based on their own observations and experiences rather than any dramatic events or compelling speeches. The process by which Temujin gradually gained the upper hand in the struggle was a testament to his understanding of human nature and his ability to create an environment where people felt valued and respected regardless of their background or previous loyalties. He made a point of welcoming former enemies who chose to join his cause, treating them with the same consideration and opportunities for advancement that he provided to his oldest and most loyal followers. And this generous approach encouraged others to make similar decisions. This policy of inclusion and forgiveness was not only morally admirable but also strategically brilliant, as it demonstrated to potential allies that Temujin was interested in building a unified Mongol nation rather than simply defeating his enemies and establishing his own dominance over them. The message that this sent throughout the steppes was that joining Temujin's confederation offered genuine opportunities for prosperity and advancement rather than mere submission to a conqueror. And this distinction proved to be crucial in attracting the support that he needed to achieve his ultimate goals. As more and more tribal groups chose to align themselves with Temujin rather than Jamukha, the balance of power shifted decisively in favor of the former, and it became increasingly clear that he was emerging as the dominant leader among the Mongol tribes. This transformation was recognized formally through a series of ceremonies and declarations in which representatives of the various confederated tribes officially acknowledged Temujin as their supreme leader and gave him the title of Khan, marking his elevation to a position of authority that transcended tribal boundaries and traditional limitations. The assumption of this new title represented much more than a simple change in rank or status, as it signified Temujin's transformation into a figure who embodied the aspirations and identity of the Mongol people as a whole rather than just another tribal leader competing for temporary advantage over his neighbors. The ceremonies that marked this elevation were conducted with great solemnity and reverence, invoking the blessings of the eternal blue sky and the spirits of the ancestors, and establishing Temujin's authority as something sacred and permanent rather than merely political and temporary. It was during this period of consolidation and formal recognition that Temujin began to be known by the name that would echo through history, as his followers started referring to him as Genghis Khan, a title that conveyed both his supreme authority over all Mongol tribes and his role as the founding father of a new and greater nation that would transcend the limitations and divisions of the past. The exact meaning and origin of this name have been debated by scholars for many centuries, but what matters most is the way it captured the imagination of his people and symbolized their hopes for a glorious future under his leadership. The early years of Genghis Khan's reign were devoted primarily to the patient work of organization and administration, as he focused on transforming his loose confederation of allied tribes into a genuine political and military unity capable of sustained action on a much larger scale than anything that had been attempted before in the history of the steppes. This was enormously complex work that required careful attention to countless details of law, custom, organization, and procedure, all of which had to be addressed while maintaining the loyalty and enthusiasm of followers who were eager for action and conquest. One of the most important aspects of this organizational work was the development of a new legal code that would govern the behavior of all members of the unified Mongol nation. establishing clear rules and procedures for everything from military discipline and the distribution of spoils and marriage customs and the resolution of disputes between different groups. This legal code, known as the Yasa, represented a careful synthesis of traditional Mongol customs with innovative new principles designed to promote unity, efficiency, and justice throughout the Confederation. The creation of the Yasa required extensive consultation with tribal elders, religious leaders, and other respected figures who possessed deep knowledge of traditional law and custom. As Genghis Khan understood that any new legal system would only be effective if it was perceived as legitimate and consistent with the fundamental values of Mongol society. At the same time, he used this process as an opportunity to introduce new concepts and practices that would help bind the various tribes together and create a stronger sense of shared identity and common purpose. The military reforms that Genghis Khan implemented during this period were equally important for the long-term success of his empire, as he systematically reorganized the traditional tribal fighting forces into a more disciplined and effective army based on decimal units of 10, 100,000 and 10,000 warriors that could be commanded and coordinated much more efficiently than the informal war bands that had characterized steppe warfare in the past. This new organizational structure also helped to break down tribal loyalties and create new bonds of solidarity that transcended traditional divisions. The implementation of these military reforms was accompanied by intensive training programs designed to ensure that all warriors understood their roles and responsibilities within the new system and could perform effectively as part of larger, coordinated operations. This training emphasized not only individual fighting skills, which Mongol warriors had always possessed in abundance, but also the disciplined communication and tactical coordination that would be essential for success in the much larger campaigns that Genghis Khan was already beginning to plan. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Genghis Khan's military reforms was his systematic promotion of officers based on merit and performance rather than birth or tribal affiliation, creating a professional military hierarchy that rewarded competence and loyalty while providing opportunities for advancement to anyone who demonstrated the necessary skills and dedication. This meritocratic approach attracted many talented individuals who might otherwise have been limited by the circumstances of their birth, and it also encouraged all warriors to strive for excellence in their duties. The success of these organizational and military reforms was demonstrated through a series of campaigns against neighboring tribes and peoples that gradually extended Mongol control throughout the steppes and established Genghis Khan's reputation as a military leader of extraordinary ability and vision. These early conquests were conducted with the same careful planning and systematic approach that characterized all aspects of his leadership, combining overwhelming force with strategic intelligence and diplomatic skill to achieve maximum results with minimum casualties among his own forces. The integration of conquered peoples into the growing Mongol Confederation was handled with particular skill and sensitivity, as Genghis Khan understood that lasting success required not just military victory, but also the willing cooperation of subject populations who had to be convinced that their lives would be better under Mongol rule than they had been under their previous leaders. This approach involved not only generous treatment of defeated enemies who chose to submit peacefully, but also careful attention to local customs and traditions that helped maintain stability and prevent rebellions. The transformation of the Mongol Confederation from a regional power on the steppes into a force capable of challenging and conquering the great settled civilizations that surrounded their homeland was a gradual process that unfolded over many years, guided by the patient wisdom and strategic vision of Genghis Khan, who understood that lasting success required not just military victory, but also the development of new systems and approaches that could effectively govern and integrate the diverse peoples and territories that would eventually come under Mongol rule. This expansion beyond the familiar grasslands of Mongolia represented a fundamental shift in both the scope and nature of Mongol ambitions. As they moved from the relatively simple world of nomadic tribal warfare into the much more complex realm of international relations, urban administration, and the management of agricultural societies that operated according to completely different principles and traditions. The first steps in this momentous expansion were taken not through sudden dramatic campaigns, but rather through careful preparation and the systematic development of the knowledge, skills, and resources that would be necessary for operations far beyond the traditional boundaries of steppe society. Genghis Khan recognized that success in campaigns against the wealthy and sophisticated civilizations that surrounded Mongolia would require much more than the courage and horsemanship that had served his people so well in their conflicts with other nomadic tribes. And he devoted considerable time and effort to learning about the military techniques, political structures, and cultural practices of potential enemies. This preparation involved the systematic gathering of intelligence through traders, diplomats, refugees, and other travelers who had first-hand knowledge of conditions in the lands beyond the steppes. As Genghis Khan understood that effective strategy depended on accurate information about enemy strengths, weaknesses, and intentions, he established an extensive network of informants and agents who could provide regular reports on political developments, military preparations, and economic conditions in the various kingdoms and empires that might eventually become targets for Mongol expansion. The accumulation of this intelligence was accompanied by equally important efforts to recruit specialists and experts who possessed the technical knowledge and administrative skills that would be essential for governing conquered territories and managing them. Complex logistics of large-scale military campaigns. These specialists included engineers who understood siege warfare and the construction of military equipment, administrators who had experience in urban government and tax collection, and scholars who could serve as interpreters and diplomatic advisors in dealings with foreign rulers and their representatives. Perhaps most importantly, Genghis Khan began to develop a sophisticated understanding of the psychological and political factors that determine the success or failure of military campaigns against settled civilizations. Recognizing that victory often depended as much on undermining enemy morale and creating internal divisions as on achieving tactical superiority on the battlefield, he studied the histories and internal conflicts of potential enemies, looking for opportunities to exploit existing grievances and rivalries that could be used to weaken resistance and facilitate Mongol conquest. The first major test of these new approaches and capabilities came with the campaigns against the Western Xia Kingdom, a wealthy and sophisticated state that controlled important trade routes along the Silk Road and that possessed both the military strength and the strategic location to serve as a potential barrier to further Mongol expansion toward the more lucrative targets that lay beyond. The decision to attack Western Xia was made only after careful consideration of all the alternatives, as Genghis Khan understood that this campaign would establish important precedents for future operations, and that its outcome would significantly influence the willingness of other powers to resist or submit to Mongol demands. The approach that the Mongols adopted in their campaign against Western Xia reflected the careful planning and systematic methodology that had become characteristic of Genghis Khan's leadership, combining traditional steppe tactics with new techniques specifically designed for warfare against fortified cities and organized armies. The campaign began not with dramatic battles, but with patient siege operations that gradually isolated enemy strongholds and cut off their communications and supply lines, creating conditions that would eventually force their surrender without the enormous casualties that would result from direct assault. This methodical approach to siege warfare represented a significant departure from traditional nomadic military practices. which had always emphasized mobility, speed, and the avoidance of prolonged engagements that could result in heavy losses among the relatively small populations of the steppe tribes. The development of effective siege techniques required not only new equipment and training, but also a fundamental change in military thinking that emphasized patience, discipline, and the careful coordination of complex operations involving thousands of warriors working together toward common objectives. The success of these new methods in the Western Xia campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of Genghis Khan's systematic approach to military innovation and adaptation, proving that the Mongol forces could successfully transition from their traditional role as raiders and skirmishers to become a disciplined army capable of conducting sophisticated operations against the most advanced military forces of their time. This success also provided valuable experience and confidence that would prove crucial in the much larger and more challenging campaigns that would follow. The integration of Western Xia territories into the growing Mongol Empire required the development of new administrative systems and governing philosophies that could effectively manage populations and regions that were fundamentally different from anything the Mongols had previously encountered. The people of Western Xia were primarily settled farmers and urban craftsmen who lived in permanent communities and followed agricultural cycles that were completely different from the nomadic pastoralism that had shaped Mongol society for countless generations. The approach that Genghis Khan adopted for governing these new territories reflected his pragmatic understanding that effective rule required respect for local customs and traditions, rather than the imposition of foreign practices that would create resentment and resistance among subject populations. He allowed existing administrative structures to continue functioning under Mongol oversight, appointing local officials who understood regional conditions and who could serve as intermediaries between the Mongol authorities and the people they governed. This policy of administrative continuity was accompanied by systematic efforts to protect and encourage the economic activities that generated the wealth and prosperity that had made these territories attractive targets for conquest in the first place. Trade routes were secured and expanded. Agricultural production was protected and promoted, and urban crafts and industries were allowed to continue operating under conditions that often provided greater security and stability than they had enjoyed under previous rulers. The success of these governing policies in Western Xia created important precedents for the administration of later conquests and demonstrated that the Mongol Empire could offer genuine benefits to subject populations rather than simply extracting tribute and resources through force and intimidation. This reputation for effective and benevolent governance became an important factor in reducing resistance to Mongol expansion. As many regions chose to submit peacefully rather than risk the destruction that might result from prolonged warfare, the experience gained in the Western Xia campaign also provided valuable lessons about the logistical challenges involved in conducting military operations far from the traditional bases of Mongol power, highlighting the importance of establishing secure supply lines and communication networks that could support armies operating at great distances from their homeland. These lessons led to the development of sophisticated systems for managing the movement of men, horses, equipment, and supplies across vast distances and challenging terrain. The success against Western Xia opened the way for the much more ambitious campaign against the Jin Dynasty, which controlled northern China and represented both the greatest challenge and the most lucrative opportunity that the Mongols had yet encountered. The Jin state was enormously wealthy and populous, with sophisticated military forces, advanced technology, and powerful fortifications that protected its major cities and strategic positions, making it a far more formidable opponent than any the Mongols had previously faced. The decision to attack the Jin dynasty was made only after extensive preparation and careful consideration of all the risks and opportunities involved. As Genghis Khan understood that this campaign would determine whether the Mongol Empire would remain a regional power limited to the steppes and their immediate neighbors, or would emerge as a world-class force capable of challenging the greatest civilizations of the age. The stakes could hardly have been higher, and the outcome would influence the course of world history for centuries to come. The initial phases of the Jin Campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of the military and administrative innovations that had been developed during the Western Xia operations. As Mongol forces systematically reduced enemy strongholds and gained control over vast territories with a combination of tactical brilliance, strategic patience, and administrative competence that impressed both allies and enemies. The campaign also revealed new aspects of Genghis Khan's genius as a military leader, particularly his ability to adapt traditional nomadic tactics to the requirements of warfare against heavily fortified positions and disciplined infantry forces. One of the most important innovations that emerged during the Jin Campaign was the systematic use of psychological warfare and propaganda to undermine enemy morale and create panic among both military forces and civilian populations. The Mongols developed a fearsome reputation for the swift and terrible punishment that awaited those who resisted their advance, while at the same time offering generous terms to those who submitted peacefully, creating powerful incentives for surrender that often made actual fighting unnecessary. This sophisticated approach to psychological warfare was accompanied by equally impressive innovations in military engineering and siegecraft, as the Mongols recruited Chinese and other specialists who possessed advanced knowledge of artillery, fortification, and urban warfare. These technical experts worked alongside traditional Mongol warriors to develop new tactical approaches that combined the mobility and flexibility of steppe cavalry with the engineering expertise necessary for reducing even the strongest fortifications. The campaign against the Jin dynasty also demonstrated the effectiveness of the new administrative systems that Genghis Khan had developed for governing conquered territories, as Mongol officials proved capable of maintaining order and prosperity in captured regions, while simultaneously supporting the military operations that continued to expand the boundaries of the empire. This dual capacity for conquest and governance was perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the early Mongol Empire, setting it apart from other nomadic powers that had been able to win victories but not to consolidate their gains into lasting political structures. The gradual success of the Jin Campaign attracted the attention and concern of other major powers throughout Asia, as rulers and strategists began to recognize that the emergence of the Mongol Empire represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power that would affect everyone regardless of their distance from the steppes. Diplomatic missions and intelligence gathering operations were dispatched to Mongolia to assess the strength and intentions of this new force, while alliances and defensive preparations were made by those who feared that they might become the next targets for Mongol expansion. These international reactions to Mongol success created both opportunities and challenges for Genghis Khan, as he found himself dealing with increasingly complex diplomatic situations that required careful balancing of competing interests and objectives. Some foreign powers sought to establish friendly relations with the Mongols in hopes of avoiding conflict or gaining advantages over their own rivals, while others began to organize coalitions and defensive alliances designed to contain or defeat the growing Mongol threat. The management of these international relationships required the development of new diplomatic institutions and practices that could effectively represent Mongol interests in negotiations with sophisticated foreign courts that operated according to complex protocols and traditions that were completely unfamiliar to people from the steppes. Genghis Khan responded to this challenge by recruiting experienced diplomats and advisors from conquered territories who could serve as intermediaries and interpreters in dealings with foreign powers. These diplomatic innovations were accompanied by equally important developments in the internal organization of the Mongol Empire, as the rapid expansion of territory and population created administrative challenges that required new approaches to communication. Coordination and control. The traditional informal methods of leadership that had worked well when the Mongol Confederation was relatively small and homogeneous were no longer adequate for managing the diverse and complex empire that was rapidly taking shape. The solution to these organizational challenges involved the systematic development of bureaucratic institutions and procedures that could maintain effective central control, while allowing for the efficient administration of local affairs by regional officials who understood local conditions and customs. This new administrative system represented a remarkable synthesis of nomadic and sedentary governing traditions, creating hybrid institutions that were uniquely suited to the requirements of ruling a vast and diverse empire. The evolution of Mongol military organization during this period was equally impressive, as traditional tribal fighting forces were transformed into professional armies that could operate effectively across enormous distances and in widely varying geographic and climatic conditions. This transformation required not only new training methods and organizational structures, but also the development of sophisticated logistical systems that could support large forces during extended campaigns far from their bases. The creation of these new military capabilities was facilitated by the systematic incorporation of specialists and technologies from conquered territories. As Genghis Khan recognized that the continued success of Mongol expansion would depend on the empire's ability to learn from and adapt the best practices of all the civilizations it encountered, this openness to innovation and adaptation became one of the most characteristic features of Mongol rule, distinguishing it from other empires that attempted to impose their own cultural and technical practices on subject populations. The period of rapid expansion and empire building that followed the initial successes against Western Xia and the Jin Dynasty was characterized by a series of carefully planned and brilliantly executed campaigns that extended Mongol control across vast regions of Asia. Each conquest building upon previous successes and creating new opportunities for further expansion. These campaigns demonstrated the remarkable adaptability and learning capacity of the Mongol military machine, as forces that had been trained for warfare on the open steppes proved equally effective in the mountains, deserts, forests, and river valleys that they encountered as their empire expanded. The administration of this rapidly growing empire required constant innovation and adaptation, as new territories brought new challenges and opportunities that had to be addressed through flexible and creative approaches to governance. The Mongol leadership demonstrated remarkable skill in developing administrative solutions that could maintain unity and coordination across enormous distances, while respecting the diversity of local conditions and customs that characterized the empire's far-flung territories. Perhaps most remarkably, the rapid expansion of the Mongol Empire was accompanied by significant improvements in the prosperity and security of most of the territories that came under Mongol rule, as the elimination of local conflicts and the establishment of secure trade routes created conditions that were often more favorable for economic development than had existed under previous rulers. This positive impact of Mongol conquest helped to explain why resistance to their expansion was often less determined than might have been expected, and why many regions chose to submit peacefully rather than fight against incorporation into the growing empire. The transformation of the Mongol Confederation from a collection of nomadic tribes into a world empire represented one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, demonstrating the extraordinary leadership capabilities of Genghis Khan and the adaptability and resilience of the Mongol people. The empire that emerged from this period of expansion would continue to grow and evolve for many decades to come, eventually encompassing the largest contiguous land empire in human history and profoundly influencing the development of civilization across much of Asia and Europe. The expansion of the Mongol Empire into the vast territories of Central Asia represented a natural progression of their growing influence and ambitions, as the steppes of Mongolia gradually gave way to the equally expansive grasslands, deserts and mountain valleys that stretched westward toward the great trading cities and ancient civilizations that had flourished along the Silk Road for many centuries before the Mongols ever dreamed of extending their reach beyond their traditional homeland. This movement into Central Asia was not accomplished through sudden dramatic campaigns, but rather through a series of patient and methodical advances that unfolded slowly over many years, like the gradual migration of herds across the changing seasons, with each step carefully planned and executed to ensure that the growing empire could effectively absorb and integrate the new territories and populations that came under Mongol control. The geography of Central Asia presented both opportunities and challenges that were quite different from anything the Mongols had previously encountered in their expansion. As the region encompassed an extraordinary diversity of landscapes and climates that ranged from the familiar grasslands that reminded them of home to vast deserts where the sand stretched endlessly under the blazing sun, to towering mountain ranges where snow-capped peaks pierced the sky and narrow valleys provided shelter for ancient communities that had developed their own unique cultures and ways of life over countless generations of relative isolation from the outside world. The Mongol armies that moved into these territories had to adapt their traditional methods of warfare and travel to accommodate the challenging conditions they encountered, learning to navigate through waterless deserts where every drop of moisture was precious and where the survival of both men and horses depended on careful planning and the precise knowledge of where wells and oases could be found along the ancient caravan routes that had been used by traders and travelers for thousands of years before the first Mongol warrior ever set foot in these distant lands. The adaptation to desert warfare required the development of new logistical systems and supply methods that were far more complex than anything needed for campaigns on the steppes, where grass and water were generally available, and where the traditional nomadic lifestyle provided most of the resources necessary for military operations. In the deserts of Central Asia, every aspect of military planning had to take into account the scarcity of water and forage, the extreme temperatures that could kill men and animals within hours if proper precautions were not taken, and the disorienting effects of sandstorms and mirages that could lead entire armies astray if they did not have experienced guides who knew the subtle landmarks and navigation techniques that made safe passage possible. The mountain regions presented different but equally significant challenges, as the high-altitude steep terrain and unpredictable weather conditions required new approaches to movement and supply that took advantage of local knowledge and expertise that could only be obtained from the people who had lived in these harsh but beautiful environments for generations. The Mongols learned to work with local guides and advisors who understood the seasonal patterns of weather and travel that determined when mountain passes would be open and safe for the movement of large forces. And they developed new techniques for maintaining communication and coordination across the difficult terrain that separated different parts of their advancing armies. Despite these challenges, the expansion into Central Asia proceeded steadily and successfully. as the Mongol leadership demonstrated the same careful planning and adaptive flexibility that had characterized their earlier conquests. Learning from each new experience and gradually developing the knowledge and capabilities necessary to operate effectively in environments that were completely foreign to their traditional way of life. The success of these campaigns was due in large part to the systematic approach that Genghis Khan had developed for gathering intelligence about new territories, recruiting local specialists and advisors, and adapting Mongol military and administrative practices to accommodate local conditions and customs. The conquest of Central Asian territories was greatly facilitated by the political fragmentation and internal conflicts that characterized the region during this period, as numerous small kingdoms, tribal confederations, and city-states competed for control of the lucrative trade routes and agricultural resources that provided the foundation for prosperity and power in this strategically important part of the world. Many of these local rulers were so focused on their immediate neighbors and traditional enemies that they failed to recognize the growing threat posed by the Mongol expansion until it was too late to organize effective resistance or defensive alliances. The Mongols were able to exploit these divisions and conflicts through a sophisticated combination of diplomatic maneuvering and military pressure that often made actual fighting unnecessary. As local rulers found themselves faced with the choice between submitting peacefully to Mongol authority or risking destruction in hopeless struggles against vastly superior forces, the reputation for both generosity toward those who submitted willingly and terrible retribution against those who resisted had preceded the Mongol armies into Central Asia, creating powerful psychological pressures that made peaceful surrender seem like the most rational choice for many local leaders. The integration of Central Asian territories into the Mongol Empire was accomplished through the same pragmatic and flexible approaches that had proven successful in other conquered regions, with local administrative structures and customs generally being preserved and adapted rather than replaced by completely foreign systems that might create resentment and instability among the subject populations. The Mongols recognized that the prosperity and strategic value of Central Asia depended on maintaining the complex networks of trade, agriculture, and craftsmanship that had developed over many centuries, and they were careful to avoid disruptions that might damage the economic foundations of their new territories. The preservation and enhancement of trade routes was particularly important in Central Asia, where the famous Silk Road and its various branches provided the primary source of wealth and the main connection between the distant civilizations of East and West that had traded goods, ideas, and technologies across these vast distances for over 1,000 years. The Mongol conquest actually improved conditions for trade by eliminating many of the local conflicts and banditry that had previously made travel dangerous and unpredictable, creating a unified political authority that could guarantee safe passage for merchants and their valuable cargoes across thousands of miles of previously hostile territory. The impact of improved trade security was felt almost immediately, as merchant caravans that had previously required large armed escorts and had faced constant risks of attack and robbery could now travel with confidence under the protection of Mongol authorities, who had both the power and the incentive to maintain order along the trade routes. This increased security led to a significant expansion in the volume and frequency of trade, bringing greater prosperity to the cities and towns that served as stopping points and trading centers along the routes, and generating increased tax revenues that helped fund the administration and defense of the growing empire. The cultural exchanges that resulted from this increased trade and communication had profound effects on both the Mongol Empire and the civilizations with which it came into contact, as ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and religious practices spread more freely and rapidly than ever before across the vast distances that separated different regions and peoples. The Mongols themselves were particularly receptive to learning from the various cultures they encountered, adopting useful technologies and administrative practices while maintaining their own cultural identity and traditional values. This openness to cultural exchange and adaptation was reflected in the religious tolerance that became one of the most distinctive characteristics of Mongol rule. As the empire encompassed populations that practiced virtually every major religion and philosophical system known to the medieval world, including various forms of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and numerous local folk traditions and shamanistic practices. Rather than attempting to impose religious uniformity or favoring any particular faith, the Mongol authorities generally allowed all religions to coexist peacefully and even encouraged dialogue and exchange between different religious communities. The administration of the Central Asian territories required the development of new governmental institutions and procedures that could effectively coordinate the activities of diverse populations spread across enormous distances, while maintaining the unity and coherence that were essential for the continued success of the empire. This challenge was met through the creation of a sophisticated system of regional administration that balanced central control with local autonomy, allowing regional governors and administrators to make decisions appropriate to local conditions while ensuring that overall policy remained consistent with imperial objectives. The communication systems that were developed to maintain contact between the central government and the distant provinces represented one of the most remarkable achievements of the Mongol administration, as messengers and official communications could travel thousands of miles across challenging terrain in relatively short periods of time thanks to an elaborate network of way stations, relay points, and supply depots that provided fresh horses, food and shelter for travelers carrying important dispatches or conducting official business on behalf of the empire. This communication system, known as the Yam, became the backbone of imperial administration and played a crucial role in maintaining the unity and effectiveness of the empire as it continued to expand across ever greater distances and encompass ever more diverse populations and territories. The system also facilitated trade and cultural exchange by providing infrastructure and security that made long-distance travel safer and more efficient than it had ever been before, contributing to the unprecedented level of connectivity and communication that characterized the Mongol period. The military organization that evolved during the Central Asian campaigns reflected the lessons learned from operating in diverse environments and against various types of enemies. As the Mongol forces became increasingly sophisticated and adaptable while maintaining the core advantages of mobility, discipline, and tactical flexibility that had made them so successful in their earlier conquests, the integration of specialists and technologies from conquered territories continued to enhance Mongol military capabilities. As engineers, artisans, and other technical experts contributed their knowledge and skills to the development of new weapons, siege equipment, and tactical methods, the treatment of conquered populations in Central Asia followed the same general principles that had proven successful elsewhere, with generous treatment for those who submitted peacefully and swift punishment for those who resisted. But the specific implementation of these policies had to be adapted to accommodate the unique characteristics and traditions of each region and community. The diversity of Central Asian societies meant that Mongol administrators had to develop considerable skill in understanding and working with different cultural, religious, and economic systems, often within the same general geographic area. The economic development that occurred under Mongol rule in Central Asia was particularly impressive, as the combination of political stability, trade security, and administrative efficiency created conditions that allowed agriculture, craftsmanship, and commerce to flourish in ways that had not been possible during the previous periods of fragmentation and conflict. Cities that had been declining due to warfare and instability experienced remarkable revivals, with populations growing and new construction projects undertaken to accommodate increased commercial activity and urban prosperity. The agricultural regions of Central Asia also benefited significantly from Mongol rule, as the elimination of local conflicts and the establishment of secure conditions for farming allowed for improvements in cultivation techniques, and the expansion of irrigated areas that increased food production and supported larger populations. The Mongols were particularly interested in promoting agricultural development because they understood that productive farming regions were essential for feeding the cities and supporting the trade that generated much of the empire's wealth and tax revenue. The gradual pace of Mongol expansion through Central Asia allowed for the careful integration of each new territory and population group, ensuring that the administrative and military systems of the empire could absorb and effectively govern the new additions without becoming overstretched or losing the coherence and unity that were essential for continued success. This methodical approach to conquest and integration became a hallmark of Mongol expansion throughout their period of greatest growth, distinguishing their empire from other rapid conquests that achieved spectacular initial success, but then collapsed due to internal weaknesses and administrative failures. The experience gained during the Central Asian campaigns provided valuable preparation for the even more ambitious expansions that would follow, as Mongol leaders learned to manage the complex challenges of governing diverse populations across vast distances while maintaining the military effectiveness and political unity that made further conquest possible. The skills and institutions developed during this period would prove essential for the success of later campaigns that would extend Mongol power across much of the known world and create the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The cultural and intellectual development that occurred within the Mongol Empire during the Central Asian period was equally significant, as the increased contact between different civilizations and the security provided by Mongol rule created unprecedented opportunities for the exchange of knowledge, ideas, and artistic traditions that enriched all the cultures that participated in this remarkable period of communication and cooperation. Scholars, artists, craftsmen, and religious teachers traveled freely throughout the empire, sharing their expertise and learning from their counterparts in distant regions. The technological innovations that resulted from this cultural exchange had far-reaching effects on the development of human civilization, as techniques and inventions that had been developed in one part of the world spread rapidly to other regions where they were adapted and improved upon by local specialists who combined foreign knowledge with their own traditional expertise. This process of technological diffusion was greatly accelerated by the security and communication systems that the Mongols established throughout their empire. The peaceful integration of Central Asian territories into the Mongol Empire demonstrated the effectiveness of the administrative and political systems that had been developed during the earlier phases of expansion, proving that the empire was capable of sustainable growth and governance rather than simply military conquest and exploitation. This success encouraged further expansion and provided a model for the incorporation of additional territories and populations that would continue the remarkable growth of the Mongol Empire for many decades to come. The legacy of the Mongol period in Central Asia continued long after the empire itself had fragmented and declined, as the trade routes, communication systems, and cultural connections that had been established during this time provided the foundation for continued interaction and exchange between East and West that would influence the course of world history for centuries to come. The memory of the peace, prosperity, and cultural flowering that had characterized the Mongol period in Central Asia became an inspiration for later rulers and political thinkers who sought to recreate the conditions that had made such remarkable achievements possible. The remarkable transformation of the Mongol Empire from a military confederation focused primarily on conquest and expansion into a sophisticated administrative system capable of governing vast territories and diverse populations represented one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of human civilization, demonstrating that the same qualities of adaptability, pragmatism, and organizational genius that had made the Mongols such effective conquerors could also be applied to the much more complex and challenging tasks of peaceful governance, economic development, and cultural integration that were essential for creating a stable and prosperous empire that could endure for generations rather than simply achieving temporary military dominance over defeated enemies. The development of effective administrative systems for governing the Mongol Empire required the creation of entirely new approaches to organization and management that could address the unprecedented challenges of coordinating activities across distances that had never before been encompassed within a single political entity, while simultaneously accommodating the extraordinary diversity of languages, cultures, religions, economic systems, and social structures that characterized the many different regions and populations that had been brought together under Mongol rule through the systematic campaigns of conquest that had unfolded over several decades of careful planning and brilliant execution. The foundation of Mongol administrative success lay in the recognition that effective governance required a careful balance between centralized control that could ensure unity of purpose and coordination of effort throughout the empire, and decentralized implementation that could adapt general policies and procedures to accommodate the specific conditions, customs, and needs of different regions and communities that might be separated by thousands of miles and centuries of distinct historical development that had created unique local traditions and expectations about the proper relationship between rulers and their subjects. This balance was achieved through the development of a hierarchical administrative structure that established clear lines of authority and responsibility extending from the Khan himself down through regional governors, provincial administrators, and local officials who were responsible for implementing imperial policies while maintaining detailed knowledge of local conditions that enabled them to make appropriate adjustments and modifications that preserved the essential objectives of central government while respecting the particular circumstances and sensitivities of the communities they served. The selection and training of administrative personnel represented one of the most crucial aspects of this system, as the success of the entire enterprise depended on finding individuals who possessed both the competence and loyalty necessary to carry out their responsibilities effectively while serving in positions that often placed them far from direct supervision and required them to make important decisions based on their own judgment and understanding of imperial objectives and local conditions that might change rapidly and unpredictably due to circumstances beyond anyone's immediate control. The Mongol approach to recruiting administrators was characteristically pragmatic and merit-based, drawing talent from all the various populations and cultural backgrounds represented within the empire rather than restricting important positions to members of the traditional Mongol nobility or attempting to impose a uniform cultural identity on the administrative apparatus that might create unnecessary tensions and inefficiencies by failing to take advantage of the expertise and local knowledge that could be contributed by capable individuals regardless of their ethnic or social origins. This inclusive approach to administration was facilitated by the development of comprehensive training programs and standardized procedures that ensured all officials throughout the empire understood their responsibilities and possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to perform their duties effectively, while also providing mechanisms for communication and coordination that maintained consistency in the implementation of imperial policies across the vast distances and cultural differences that characterized the empire's far-flung territories and diverse populations. The legal system that evolved to govern the Mongol Empire represented a remarkable synthesis of traditional Mongol customs with legal principles and procedures derived from the various civilizations that had been incorporated into the empire, creating a comprehensive code of laws and regulations that could provide consistent and predictable justice while respecting the legitimate expectations and traditional practices of different communities that had developed their own approaches to resolving disputes and maintaining social order over many centuries of independent development. The famous Yasa, which served as the fundamental legal code of the empire, established basic principles and procedures that applied throughout all Mongol territories, while allowing for considerable flexibility in the specific implementation of these principles to accommodate local customs and traditions that did not conflict with the essential requirements of imperial unity and security. This approach enabled the Mongols to maintain legal consistency and predictability across their vast empire while avoiding the social disruption and resistance that might have resulted from attempting to impose completely foreign legal systems on populations that had their own well-established traditions of law and justice. The administration of justice throughout the empire was facilitated by the establishment of courts and judicial procedures at various levels of the administrative hierarchy, with local magistrates handling routine disputes and minor infractions according to established procedures and local customs, while more serious cases and matters involving imperial policy or interregional issues were referred to higher levels of authority where specialized judges and legal experts could provide the knowledge and experience necessary to ensure appropriate and consistent resolution of complex legal questions. The tax collection system that supported the financial needs of the empire represented another remarkable achievement in administrative organization, as it required the development of standardized assessment and collection procedures that could generate adequate revenue to support the extensive military and civilian bureaucracy that was necessary for governing such a vast and diverse empire, while avoiding the kind of excessive taxation that might provoke rebellion or economic disruption that could undermine the prosperity and stability that made the empire valuable to both its rulers and its subjects. The Mongol approach to taxation was generally more systematic and predictable than the arbitrary levies and confiscations that had characterized many previous conquests, with clear procedures for assessing the tax obligations of different regions and communities based on their productive capacity and economic circumstances, and established mechanisms for collecting these taxes in ways that minimized disruption to normal economic activities while ensuring that imperial revenue needs were met consistently and reliably. The collection of taxes was facilitated by detailed surveys and censuses that provided accurate information about population, agricultural production, commercial activity, and other economic factors that determined the taxable capacity of different regions, while also serving important administrative functions by providing the demographic and economic data that imperial planners needed for making informed decisions about resource allocation, military recruitment, infrastructure development, and other aspects of imperial governance that required detailed knowledge of local conditions and capabilities. The communication system that connected all parts of the empire was perhaps the most impressive achievement of Mongol administration, as it enabled rapid and reliable transmission of information, orders and reports across distances that would have required months of travel under normal circumstances, creating an unprecedented level of coordination and control that allowed the central government to respond quickly to developments in distant provinces while ensuring that local administrators throughout the empire remained informed about imperial policies and priorities that might affect their own responsibilities and activities. The famous YAM system of relay stations and messenger routes represented a massive infrastructure investment that required careful planning, substantial resources, and ongoing maintenance, but which provided enormous benefits in terms of administrative efficiency and imperial unity by making it possible for the Khan and his central administration to maintain effective control and coordination across the vast territories of the empire. The system also facilitated trade, cultural exchange, and the movement of people and ideas that contributed to the prosperity and intellectual development that characterized the Mongol period. The operation of the YAM system required the establishment of thousands of relay stations positioned at regular intervals along the major routes that connected different parts of the empire, with each station maintaining supplies of fresh horses, food, lodging, and other necessities that enabled official messengers and travelers to continue their journeys without delay while ensuring that the horses and equipment used for long-distance communication remained in excellent condition and capable of maintaining the rapid pace that was essential for effective imperial administration. The personnel who operated this communication system were specially trained and equipped for their demanding responsibilities, which required not only excellent horsemanship and physical endurance, but also detailed knowledge of routes, conditions, and procedures that enabled them to navigate safely and efficiently across challenging terrain while carrying important dispatches and maintaining the security and confidentiality that were essential for sensitive official communications that might affect the security and governance of the entire empire. The economic policies implemented throughout the Mongol Empire reflected the same pragmatic and adaptive approach that characterized other aspects of Mongol administration, with emphasis placed on maintaining and enhancing the productive activities that generated the wealth and prosperity that made the empire valuable to its rulers while avoiding interference with established economic practices and relationships that were functioning effectively under existing conditions and did not require modification or improvement through imperial intervention. The promotion of trade and commerce was a particularly important aspect of Mongol economic policy, as the rulers understood that prosperous commercial activity generated tax revenue, while also creating employment and opportunities that helped maintain political stability and popular support throughout the empire. The security and infrastructure provided by Mongol administration created conditions that were generally much more favorable for trade than had existed previously, leading to significant expansion in commercial activity and economic development that benefited both merchants and the communities that served as trading centers and markets. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies that was implemented throughout much of the empire facilitated commercial transactions and reduced the costs and uncertainties that had previously complicated trade between different regions that used different systems for measuring and valuing goods and services. This standardization also supported the development of more sophisticated financial instruments and credit arrangements that enabled merchants to conduct business over greater distances and with larger volumes of goods than had been practical under previous conditions. The protection of merchant caravans and trading expeditions was provided through a combination of military patrols, diplomatic agreements and legal guarantees that created an unprecedented level of security for long-distance trade, enabling merchants to travel with confidence across thousands of miles of territory that had previously been dangerous and unpredictable due to banditry. Local conflicts and the arbitrary actions of petty rulers who might confiscate goods or impose unexpected taxes and fees that could make commercial ventures unprofitable or impossible. The cultural policies of the Mongol Empire demonstrated the same tolerance and adaptability that characterized other aspects of imperial administration, with general respect for local customs, traditions, and religious practices that did not conflict with imperial security or administrative requirements. This approach enabled the empire to maintain stability and popular acceptance among diverse populations while avoiding the cultural conflicts and religious tensions that had plagued many previous empires and that often led to rebellions and internal divisions that weakened imperial unity and effectiveness. The religious tolerance that became one of the most distinctive characteristics of Mongol rule was not merely a matter of indifference or neglect, but rather reflected a deliberate policy of accommodation and inclusion that recognized the importance of respecting the deeply held beliefs and practices of subject populations, while ensuring that religious differences did not become sources of political conflict or administrative complications that might undermine imperial stability and unity. This policy of religious tolerance was implemented through practical measures that protected the rights and properties of religious institutions and communities throughout the empire, while ensuring that religious leaders and organizations did not interfere with imperial administration or attempt to use their influence and authority to oppose or undermine the legitimate activities of imperial officials and administrators who were responsible for maintaining order and implementing imperial policies. The patronage and support that the Mongol rulers provided to scholars, artists, craftsmen, and other cultural figures helped create an environment of intellectual and artistic flowering that enriched all the civilizations encompassed within the empire while contributing to the development of new ideas, techniques, and forms of expression that synthesized influences from many different cultural traditions and geographical regions that had been brought into contact through the unprecedented connectivity and communication that characterized the Mongol period. The educational and scholarly activities that flourished under Mongol patronage included the translation of important texts and documents between different languages, the compilation of historical records and administrative documents that preserved knowledge about the empire and its various constituent regions and populations, and the development of new techniques and technologies that improved agricultural production, manufacturing processes, and other practical activities that contributed to the prosperity and well-being of people throughout the empire. The architectural and engineering projects undertaken during the Mongol period reflected both the wealth and ambition of the empire and the practical needs of governing such vast territories, with major construction projects including palaces, administrative buildings, fortifications, roads, bridges, irrigation systems, and other infrastructure that supported the military. Economic and administrative activities that were essential for maintaining imperial unity and effectiveness across the enormous distances and diverse conditions that characterized the empire. The urban development that occurred under Mongol rule was particularly impressive, as many cities experienced significant growth and improvement due to the increased trade, security, and administrative importance that resulted from their incorporation into the empire. New construction projects improved infrastructure and expanded commercial activities transformed many urban centers into thriving cosmopolitan communities that attracted residents, visitors, and traders from throughout the known world. The agricultural policies implemented by the Mongol administration focused on maintaining and improving food production while ensuring that farming communities had the security, resources and incentives necessary to maximize their productive capacity and contribute effectively to the overall prosperity of the empire. This included protection from bandits and raiders, reasonable taxation that did not discourage agricultural investment and improvement, and technical assistance and support that helped farmers adopt new techniques and crops that could increase yields and improve nutrition for growing populations. The integration of different agricultural systems and techniques from various parts of the empire led to significant improvements in farming methods and crop varieties that increased food production and dietary diversity throughout many regions, while the security and trade networks established by the Mongols facilitated the movement of agricultural products from surplus areas to regions where additional food supplies were needed due to population growth. Crop failures or other circumstances that might otherwise have led to shortages and hardship. The legal protections and administrative procedures that governed land ownership and agricultural tenure provided farmers and landowners with security and predictability that encouraged long-term investment in land improvement. Irrigation systems and other agricultural infrastructure that increased productive capacity while contributing to the overall wealth and stability of the empire. These policies also helped prevent the kind of land disputes and conflicts that had often disrupted agricultural production in previous periods of political uncertainty and administrative weakness. The management of natural resources throughout the empire required sophisticated coordination and planning that took into account the different geographical and climatic conditions that affected the availability and accessibility of various materials and commodities that were essential for military, administrative, and economic activities. This included the exploitation of mineral deposits, forest resources, and other natural assets that could be used to support imperial needs while ensuring that local communities retained access to the resources they needed for their own survival and prosperity. The environmental policies of the Mongol administration generally emphasized sustainable use of natural resources rather than intensive exploitation that might damage long-term productive capacity, reflecting the traditional nomadic understanding of the importance of maintaining the health and productivity of natural ecosystems that could continue to support human activities over many generations rather than being depleted through short-term extraction and exploitation that might provide immediate benefits but could not be sustained indefinitely. The diplomatic relationships that the Mongol Empire maintained with neighboring powers and distant kingdoms required sophisticated understanding of international law, cultural differences, and political traditions that governed relations between sovereign states and rulers who recognized each other as legitimate authorities with whom agreements and treaties could be negotiated and maintained over extended periods of time. Despite the changes in leadership and circumstances that inevitably occurred in all political entities, the diplomatic corps that represented Mongol interests in these international relationships included experienced negotiators and cultural experts who possessed detailed knowledge of the languages, customs, and political systems of the various foreign powers with whom the empire needed to maintain relationships, whether as allies, trading partners, or potential adversaries whose intentions and capabilities needed to be monitored and understood for purposes of imperial security and strategic planning. The peaceful resolution of disputes and conflicts through negotiation and compromise was generally preferred to military action whenever possible, as the Mongol leadership understood that warfare was expensive, disruptive, and unpredictable, while diplomatic solutions could often achieve imperial objectives more efficiently and with less risk to imperial resources and personnel than could be accomplished through military campaigns that might result in heavy casualties and uncertain outcomes that could damage imperial prestige and effectiveness. The gentle flow of trade across the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire created one of the most remarkable periods of peaceful commercial exchange and cultural interaction in human history. as the ancient routes that had connected east and west for countless centuries were transformed under Mongol protection into secure highways of prosperity where merchants, travelers, scholars, and pilgrims could journey safely across thousands of miles of diverse terrain, carrying with them not only the precious goods and valuable commodities that formed the foundation of international commerce, but also the ideas, technologies, artistic traditions, and religious beliefs that would enrich all the civilizations that participated in this unprecedented network of peaceful exchange and mutual cooperation. The famous Silk Road, which had existed in various forms for over 1,000 years before the rise of the Mongol Empire, experienced its greatest period of prosperity and security under the careful administration and military protection that the Mongols provided throughout their vast territories, creating conditions that were more favorable for long-distance trade than had ever existed before in the long and often dangerous history of commercial travel between the distant civilizations of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East that had developed their own unique products, techniques, and cultural treasures that other peoples were eager to obtain and enjoy. The transformation of these ancient trade routes under Mongol rule was not accomplished through any sudden dramatic changes, but rather through the patient application of the same administrative principles and practical policies that had proven so successful in other aspects of imperial governance, with careful attention paid to creating and maintaining the security, infrastructure, and regulatory framework that were essential for encouraging and supporting the complex logistical operations that were required for moving valuable goods safely and efficiently across the enormous distances and challenging terrain that separated the major commercial centers of the medieval world. The security that the Mongols provided for merchant caravans and trading expeditions was perhaps the most important factor in the remarkable expansion of commercial activity that occurred during this period, as the elimination of banditry, local conflicts, and arbitrary taxation had previously made long-distance trade extremely risky and often unprofitable due to the constant threat of loss through robbery, confiscation, or the various fees and tribute payments that local rulers and petty warlords had traditionally extracted from merchants who were forced to pass through their territories while traveling between distant markets and commercial centers. The Mongol approach to providing this security was characteristically systematic and comprehensive, with regular patrols of mounted warriors maintaining surveillance over the major trade routes and ensuring that any threats to merchant safety were quickly identified and eliminated before they could develop into serious problems that might discourage commercial activity or damage the reputation for safety and reliability that was essential for attracting the international trade that generated substantial tax revenues and contributed significantly to the overall prosperity of the empire and its many diverse populations. The infrastructure improvements that were implemented throughout the Mongol Empire to support increased trade activity included the expansion and maintenance of roads, bridges, and way stations that provided essential services for travelers and their animals, while also serving as collection points for the customs duties and taxes that formed an important source of imperial revenue without being so burdensome as to discourage commercial activity or make trading ventures unprofitable for the merchants who were willing to undertake the considerable risks and expenses involved in long-distance commerce across challenging terrain and through regions with different languages, customs, and regulatory systems. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies that was gradually implemented throughout much of the empire greatly simplified commercial transactions and reduced the costs and complications that had previously made trade between different regions unnecessarily difficult and expensive, while also reducing opportunities for fraud and manipulation that had sometimes damaged the trust and confidence that were essential for the smooth operation of commercial relationships between merchants, customers, and officials from different cultural backgrounds and business traditions. The establishment of regular diplomatic and commercial relationships between the Mongol Empire and neighboring kingdoms and distant trading partners created a stable international environment that encouraged long-term commercial planning and investment, as merchants could rely on the continuation of peaceful conditions and predictable regulatory policies that made it possible to develop ongoing business relationships and establish permanent trading networks that could operate profitably over many years, rather than depending on temporary opportunities that might disappear due to political instability or changes in official policy. The caravanserais and trading posts that were established or improved throughout the empire provided essential services for the merchant communities that formed the backbone of long-distance trade, offering secure storage for valuable goods, comfortable accommodations for travelers and their animals, and opportunities for merchants from different regions to meet, exchange information, negotiate business arrangements, and form the partnerships and alliances that were often necessary for organizing and financing the complex trading expeditions that could extend over many months and cover thousands of miles of often challenging terrain. These commercial centers also served as important focal points for cultural exchange and intellectual development, as merchants, scholars, craftsmen, and religious teachers from many different backgrounds gathered together in cosmopolitan communities where ideas, techniques, and traditions could be shared and combined in new ways that enriched all the cultures represented in these remarkable meeting places of international commerce and peaceful cooperation between peoples who might otherwise have remained isolated from each other by distance, language barriers, and cultural differences. The goods that flowed along these trade routes represented the finest products and most valuable commodities that each region could offer, creating a vast network of economic interdependence that connected distant civilizations through their shared appreciation for quality craftsmanship, exotic materials, and unique cultural products that could not be obtained locally but which added richness, beauty, and practical value to the lives of people throughout the known world who were willing to pay premium prices for access to these treasured items. The silk that gave its name to the most famous of these trade routes was perhaps the most luxurious and highly prized of all the commodities that moved along these peaceful highways of commerce, as the exquisite fabrics produced by Chinese artisans were treasured throughout the world for their beauty, durability, and the incredible skill required to create them through techniques that were carefully guarded secrets passed down through generations of specialized craftsmen who devoted their entire lives to perfecting their art and creating products that were worthy of the highest nobility and wealthiest merchants in distant lands. The spices and aromatic substances that were transported from the tropical regions of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean were equally valuable and sought after, as these exotic flavors and fragrances could transform ordinary foods into magnificent feasts while also providing medicinal benefits and religious significance that made them essential elements in the cultural and spiritual life of civilizations. Throughout Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, where local climates and soil conditions made it impossible to produce these precious commodities domestically. The precious metals, gems, and jewelry that were traded along these routes represented not only significant monetary value but also the artistic traditions and aesthetic sensibilities of the various cultures that produced them, as skilled craftsmen incorporated local materials, techniques, and design principles into beautiful objects that served both practical and decorative purposes while demonstrating the wealth, taste, and cultural sophistication of their owners and the societies that created them. The books, manuscripts, and scholarly works that were carried by merchants and learned travelers contributed to an unprecedented exchange of knowledge and ideas that accelerated intellectual development throughout the connected regions, as mathematical concepts, scientific discoveries, philosophical insights, and technical innovations developed in one civilization could quickly spread to other regions where they were studied. adapted and improved upon by local scholars who combined foreign knowledge with their own traditional wisdom and practical experience. The religious texts and artifacts that moved along these trade routes facilitated the peaceful spread of various spiritual traditions and belief systems that enriched the religious and philosophical life of many different cultures, as Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and other faiths found new audiences and opportunities for growth in regions far from their original homelands, while also being influenced and modified by contact with local traditions and practices that created new forms of religious expression and spiritual understanding. The artistic works and decorative objects that were exchanged through this trade network carried with them the aesthetic principles and creative techniques of their cultures of origin, inspiring artists and craftsmen in distant regions to experiment with new styles, materials and methods that combined foreign influences with local traditions to create innovative forms of artistic expression that reflected the cosmopolitan and culturally diverse character of the interconnected world that had been created through the peaceful exchange of goods and ideas. The technological innovations and practical techniques that spread through these commercial networks had profound effects on agricultural production, manufacturing processes, military technology, and many other aspects of daily life throughout the connected regions. As useful inventions and improvements developed in one area could quickly be adapted and implemented in distant locations where they contributed to increased productivity, improved quality of life, and enhanced capabilities in various fields of human endeavor. The musical instruments, compositions, and performance traditions that were shared through these cultural exchanges created new forms of artistic expression that combined elements from different musical traditions to produce innovative styles and genres that reflected the multicultural character of the merchant communities and cosmopolitan cities that served as centers of international trade and cultural interaction during this remarkable period of peaceful cooperation and mutual enrichment. The culinary traditions and food preparation techniques that were exchanged along these routes led to significant improvements in nutrition and cuisine throughout many regions. As new crops, cooking methods, and flavor combinations were introduced to areas where they had been previously unknown, creating more diverse and interesting diets while also improving food preservation techniques that made long-distance travel and trade more practical and enjoyable for merchants and other travelers. The medical knowledge and healing practices that were shared between different cultures through these trade networks contributed to significant advances in healthcare and treatment of diseases throughout the connected regions. As physicians and healers learned about new medicines, surgical techniques, and therapeutic approaches that had been developed in distant lands and which could be adapted and applied to improve the health and well-being of local populations. The agricultural techniques and crop varieties that were introduced through these commercial exchanges led to increased food production and improved nutrition in many regions, as farmers learned about new planting methods, irrigation systems, and plant varieties that were better adapted to local conditions or which could provide higher yields and better nutrition than traditional crops, contributing to population growth and economic development throughout the trade network. The manufacturing techniques and production methods that were shared through these peaceful exchanges enabled craftsmen and artisans in different regions to improve the quality and efficiency of their work while also learning to produce new types of goods that had previously been available only through expensive imports from distant lands, creating new opportunities for local economic development and reducing dependence on foreign suppliers for essential commodities and luxury items. The navigation techniques and geographical knowledge that were accumulated through these extensive trading expeditions contributed to significant improvements in map-making, travel planning and exploration that expanded the known world and made subsequent journeys safer and more efficient, while also providing valuable scientific information about climate, terrain, and natural resources that enhanced understanding of the physical world and its potential for human development and exploitation. The language skills and cultural knowledge that were developed by merchants, diplomats, and other travelers who participated in this extensive network of international exchange created a cosmopolitan community of individuals who could serve as interpreters, advisors, and intermediaries in diplomatic negotiations. Commercial transactions and cultural exchanges that required understanding of different languages, customs, and business practices to be successful and mutually beneficial for all parties involved. The financial instruments and commercial practices that were developed to facilitate long-distance trade created new forms of banking, credit, and investment that made possible increasingly sophisticated and large-scale commercial operations while also reducing the risks and costs associated with moving valuable goods across vast distances and through regions with different currencies, legal systems, and business customs that might otherwise have made international trade prohibitively difficult and expensive. The legal frameworks and dispute resolution mechanisms that were established to govern commercial relationships and resolve conflicts between merchants from different cultures and legal traditions created unprecedented levels of trust and confidence in international trade relationships, while also providing models for international cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution that would influence diplomatic and commercial practices for centuries to come. The educational opportunities and intellectual exchanges that occurred in the major trading centers and along the routes themselves created informal universities and centers of learning where students and scholars from many different backgrounds could study together, share knowledge, and develop new insights and understanding that combined the wisdom and expertise of multiple cultural traditions in ways that advanced human knowledge and understanding far beyond what any single civilization could have achieved in isolation. The peaceful coexistence and mutual respect that characterized relationships between different cultural, religious, and ethnic groups within the trading communities demonstrated that people from diverse backgrounds could work together successfully for mutual benefit when they were united by common economic interests, and when they operated within frameworks that protected the rights and interests of all participants while encouraging cooperation and discouraging conflict and discrimination. The prosperity and cultural flowering that resulted from this unprecedented period of peaceful international trade and cultural exchange created conditions that supported population growth, urban development, artistic achievement, and intellectual advancement throughout the connected regions, demonstrating the enormous benefits that could result from peaceful cooperation and mutual exchange rather than conflict. Isolation and competition between different peoples and civilizations. The legacy of this remarkable period of peaceful trade and cultural exchange continued to influence international relations, commercial practices, and cultural development long after the political unity of the Mongol Empire had fragmented and declined. As the networks of relationship, knowledge, and mutual understanding that had been created during this time provided foundations for continued cooperation and exchange that enriched human civilization for many centuries to come and established precedents for international cooperation that continued to inspire efforts toward peaceful global integration and mutual prosperity in the modern world. The enduring influence of Mongol governance extended far beyond the temporal boundaries of their empire itself, creating a legacy of administrative innovation, legal development, and political organization that would continue to shape the course of human civilization for many centuries after the Great Khan's descendants had ceased to rule over the vast territories that had once comprised the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. demonstrating that the true measure of their achievement lay not merely in the spectacular military conquests that had captured the imagination of contemporary observers and future historians, but rather in the quiet, systematic development of governmental institutions and administrative practices that proved so effective and enduring that they were adapted and preserved by successor states and distant kingdoms that recognized the practical value of the organizational methods and governing principles that had made Mongol rule so remarkably successful across such an enormous diversity of territories, populations, and cultural traditions. The administrative systems that had been developed to govern the Mongol Empire represented a remarkable synthesis of practical experience, cultural wisdom, and innovative thinking that drew upon the best traditions and practices of all the various civilizations that had been incorporated into the empire, while also introducing new concepts and methods that were specifically designed to address the unique challenges of ruling over vast distances and diverse populations in an era when communication and transportation were limited by the fundamental constraints of human and animal endurance, rather than the mechanical and electronic technologies that would later transform the possibilities for coordination and control across great distances and complex organizational structures. The legal framework that had been established through the famous Yasa and its various supplements and modifications continued to influence legal development in many regions long after the original Mongol administration had been replaced by other forms of government, as the principles of legal consistency, procedural fairness, and cultural tolerance that had been embedded in Mongol law provided valuable precedents for later rulers who faced similar challenges in governing diverse populations with different traditions, customs, and expectations about the proper relationship between governmental authority and individual rights and community autonomy. The concept of merit-based advancement that had been such a revolutionary feature of Mongol administration gradually spread to other political systems and governmental institutions throughout the regions that had experienced Mongol rule, creating new opportunities for talented individuals to achieve positions of responsibility and influence regardless of their family background or social origins, while also establishing the principle that governmental effectiveness depended on selecting and promoting officials based on their competence and dedication rather than their connections or inherited status within traditional hierarchical structures. The religious tolerance that had characterized Mongol governance became a model for other rulers who sought to maintain stability and unity within their own diverse populations, demonstrating that political authority could be maintained and strengthened through policies that respected and protected the legitimate religious practices and spiritual beliefs of different communities, rather than attempting to impose uniformity through coercion or persecution that often created resentment, resistance, and internal conflicts that weakened the state and diverted resources from more productive activities and beneficial development projects. The economic policies that had been implemented throughout the Mongol Empire, particularly those relating to trade promotion, infrastructure development, and monetary standardization, provided valuable lessons and practical examples for later governments that sought to encourage commercial activity and economic growth within their own territories, while also demonstrating the benefits that could be achieved through international cooperation and peaceful exchange rather than economic nationalism and protectionist policies that restricted trade and limited opportunities for mutual prosperity and cultural enrichment. The communication systems that had been developed to maintain coordination and control throughout the vast Mongol territories established important precedents for later innovations in governmental administration and commercial organization, showing how systematic planning, substantial investment, and careful maintenance could create infrastructure networks that facilitated not only official communications but also commercial activity. cultural exchange, and the spread of knowledge and innovations that benefited all the communities that were connected through these carefully maintained systems of transportation and information transmission. The diplomatic practices that had been developed for managing relationships between the Mongol Empire and other political entities provided valuable experience and established important precedents for international relations that would influence diplomatic practices for many centuries to come, particularly in areas such as treaty negotiation, trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and the peaceful resolution of disputes through negotiation and compromise rather than military conflict that was expensive, destructive, and unpredictable in its outcomes and long-term consequences. The urban planning and development policies that had been implemented in cities throughout the Mongol Empire demonstrated the benefits of systematic approaches to municipal administration that balanced the needs of different communities and interest groups while promoting economic development, cultural activities, and public welfare through carefully planned infrastructure projects, building regulations and public services that improved the quality of life for urban residents, while also supporting the commercial and administrative activities that made cities important centers of regional and imperial government. The agricultural policies that had been developed to support food production and rural prosperity throughout the empire provided valuable examples of how governmental support and protection could enhance farming productivity and rural development, without interfering unnecessarily with traditional practices and local customs that had evolved over many generations to suit particular environmental conditions and cultural preferences, while also demonstrating the importance of maintaining adequate food supplies and rural stability as foundations for overall imperial prosperity and security. The military organization that had been developed during the period of Mongol expansion continued to influence military thinking and practice in many regions long after the original Mongol armies had been disbanded or absorbed into other military systems, as the principles of tactical flexibility, disciplined coordination, and merit-based leadership that had made Mongol forces so effective provided valuable lessons for later military commanders and strategic planners who faced their own challenges in organizing and deploying armed forces under changing conditions and against various types of enemies and military threats. The educational and scholarly activities that had been promoted and supported throughout the Mongol Empire created lasting institutions and traditions of learning that continued to flourish long after the original imperial patronage had ended, as the libraries, schools, and research centers that had been established during the period of Mongol rule provided foundations for continued intellectual development and cultural achievement that enriched the lives of countless individuals and contributed to the advancement of human knowledge and understanding in many different fields of study and creative endeavor. The technological innovations and industrial developments that had been encouraged and facilitated through Mongol policies of cultural exchange and technical cooperation continued to influence manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, and many other aspects of economic and social life throughout the regions that had been part of the empire. As useful inventions, improved techniques, and more efficient production methods spread from their original places of development to new locations where they were adapted and further refined to suit local conditions and requirements. The cultural preservation efforts that had been undertaken throughout the empire to protect and maintain the distinctive traditions, languages, and artistic practices of different communities created valuable repositories of human cultural heritage that continued to enrich the lives of later generations, while also demonstrating the importance of respecting and celebrating cultural diversity rather than attempting to impose uniformity that might destroy valuable traditions and eliminate sources of creativity and innovation that could benefit entire societies and future generations. The administrative training programs that had been developed to prepare officials for service throughout the empire established important precedents for professional education and career development that influenced governmental practices in many regions for centuries to come, showing how systematic preparation, ongoing education, and performance evaluation could improve the effectiveness of public administration while also creating opportunities for personal advancement and professional satisfaction among individuals who chose to devote their careers to public service and governmental responsibility. The record-keeping and documentation practices that had been implemented throughout the empire created valuable archives and historical sources that preserved important information about governmental procedures, legal decisions, commercial transactions, and cultural activities that provided later scholars and administrators with detailed knowledge about effective administrative practices and successful approaches to the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast territories with limited communication and transportation capabilities. The taxation systems that had been developed to support imperial finances while maintaining economic prosperity and political stability provided valuable lessons about the importance of balancing governmental revenue needs with the economic well-being of taxpayers, demonstrating how careful assessment, predictable procedures, and reasonable rates could generate adequate public revenues without discouraging productive economic activity or creating resentment and resistance that might undermine political stability and social cooperation. The public works projects that had been undertaken throughout the empire to improve infrastructure, enhance urban amenities, and support economic development created lasting benefits that continue to serve local populations long after the original imperial administration had ended, while also demonstrating how governmental investment in public infrastructure could stimulate economic growth, improve quality of life, and strengthen social cohesion by providing shared benefits that served the interests of entire communities rather than just privileged elites or special interest groups. The conflict resolution mechanisms that had been developed to handle disputes between different communities, regions, and interest groups provided valuable precedents for peaceful problem-solving that emphasized negotiation, mediation, and compromise rather than force or coercion, showing how patient dialogue and mutual respect could resolve even serious disagreements and create solutions that satisfied the legitimate interests of all parties involved while maintaining overall stability and social harmony. The environmental policies that had been implemented to protect natural resources and maintain ecological balance demonstrated early recognition of the importance of sustainable development practices that could support human activities without destroying the environmental foundations that made long-term prosperity and social stability possible, providing valuable lessons about the need to balance immediate economic needs with long-term environmental protection and resource conservation. The immigration and settlement policies that had been developed to manage population movements and integrate newcomers into existing communities showed how governmental support and careful planning could facilitate peaceful migration and cultural integration while respecting the rights and interests of both established populations and new arrivals, creating more diverse and dynamic communities that benefited from the skills, knowledge, and perspectives that different groups brought to their new homes. The disaster response and emergency management systems that had been established to deal with natural disasters, crop failures, and other crises provided valuable experience in coordinating relief efforts and maintaining social stability during difficult periods, demonstrating how advanced planning, Resource reserves and effective communication could minimize the impact of unavoidable problems while maintaining public confidence and social cohesion during challenging times. The healthcare and public welfare policies that had been implemented throughout the empire showed how governmental attention to public health and social welfare could improve quality of life while also strengthening economic productivity and political stability by ensuring that populations remained healthy, educated, and capable of contributing effectively to their communities and the broader society of which they were part. The artistic and cultural patronage that had been provided throughout the empire created lasting traditions of creativity and cultural achievement that continued to flourish long after the original imperial support had ended, demonstrating how governmental encouragement and protection of artistic activities could enrich the cultural life of entire societies while also preserving valuable traditions and fostering innovation that contributed to human cultural development and creative expression. The scientific and technical research that had been supported and encouraged throughout the empire led to important discoveries and innovations that improved agricultural productivity, manufacturing efficiency, medical treatment, and many other aspects of daily life, while also advancing human understanding of natural phenomena and creating foundations for further scientific and technical development that would benefit future generations and contribute to the ongoing advancement of human knowledge and capability. The international trade agreements and commercial partnerships that had been established during the period of Mongol rule created lasting economic relationships and trading networks that continued to facilitate peaceful exchange and mutual prosperity long after the original political framework had changed, demonstrating how economic cooperation and commercial interdependence could create strong incentives for maintaining peaceful relationships and resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than military confrontation. The language preservation and literary development efforts that had been undertaken throughout the empire helped maintain the linguistic diversity and literary traditions that were important parts of the cultural heritage of many different communities, while also facilitating communication and cultural exchange by supporting the development of common languages and translation practices that enabled people from different linguistic backgrounds to communicate effectively and share their knowledge in. Cultural treasures. The architectural and engineering achievements that had been accomplished during the period of Mongol rule created lasting monuments and practical infrastructure that continued to serve communities for many centuries, while also demonstrating advanced techniques and design principles that influenced architectural and engineering practice in many regions and contributed to the development of more sophisticated and effective approaches to construction and urban planning. The legal education and judicial training programs that had been established to ensure consistent and effective administration of justice throughout the empire created professional traditions and educational institutions that continued to prepare legal professionals and judicial officials long after the original imperial administration had ended, contributing to the development of more sophisticated and effective legal systems that better served the needs of diverse populations and complex societies. The diplomatic training and international relations expertise that had been developed during the period of Mongol expansion and administration created valuable knowledge and professional capabilities that continued to influence diplomatic practice and international relations for many centuries. As experienced diplomats and international affairs specialists shared their knowledge and skills with later generations of officials who faced their own challenges in managing relationships between different political entities and cultural communities. The peaceful transition processes that were eventually implemented as the Mongol Empire gradually evolved and fragmented into smaller political entities demonstrated how major political changes could be managed without destroying the valuable institutions and beneficial practices that had been developed during the period of unified rule. preserving many of the achievements and innovations that had contributed to prosperity and stability while allowing for new forms of political organization that better suited changing conditions and local preferences. The historical documentation and scholarly analysis that was undertaken to preserve knowledge about Mongol governmental practices and administrative innovations created valuable resources for later scholars, administrators, and political leaders who sought to understand and learn from this remarkable period of effective governance across vast territories and diverse populations, ensuring that the lessons and achievements of Mongol administration would not be lost but would continue to inform and inspire efforts to create effective and beneficial governmental institutions for future generations. The gradual transformation of the Great Mongol Empire from a unified political entity under the supreme authority of a single Khan into a collection of related but increasingly independent kingdoms and territories was not accomplished through dramatic upheavals or sudden catastrophic events, but rather unfolded slowly and peacefully over many decades through a natural process of administrative evolution and cultural adaptation that reflected the practical challenges of governing such vast territories and diverse populations across the enormous distances that separated the eastern and western boundaries of this remarkable political creation, while also accommodating the inevitable changes in leadership, priorities, and local conditions that occurred as successive generations of rulers and administrators faced new circumstances and opportunities that required different approaches and solutions from those that had been appropriate during the initial period of rapid expansion and military conquest. The peaceful nature of this transition process was largely due to the wisdom and foresight of the early Mongol leaders who had recognized from the beginning that the enormous scope and complexity of their empire would eventually require more flexible and decentralized forms of governance that could respond effectively to local conditions and regional needs, while maintaining the essential unity of purpose and coordination of effort that were necessary for preserving the benefits and achievements that had been accomplished through the great period of expansion and empire building that had brought prosperity, security, and cultural enrichment to millions of people across the vast expanse of territory that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Western Europe. The succession arrangements that had been established by Genghis Khan and his immediate heirs reflected a sophisticated understanding of the practical realities of governing such an enormous and diverse empire. As the division of territories and responsibilities among different branches of the imperial family created opportunities for specialized administration and regional expertise while maintaining family unity and shared commitment to the basic principles and values that had made Mongol rule so successful and beneficial for the populations that had been brought together under imperial authority through the remarkable campaigns of conquest and peaceful integration that had characterized the early decades of empire development. The gradual process by which different regions of the empire began to develop their own distinctive characteristics and administrative practices was facilitated by the cultural tolerance and administrative flexibility that had always been fundamental features of Mongol governance. As local customs, traditions, and practices were increasingly integrated with imperial policies and procedures to create hybrid systems of government that combined the best elements of both Mongol and local approaches to administration, law, economics, and social organization in ways that served the particular needs and preferences of different regional populations while preserving the essential unity and coordination that were necessary for maintaining peace, prosperity, and security throughout the interconnected territories of the empire. The Ilkhanate that developed in Persia and the surrounding regions represented one of the most successful examples of this process of peaceful cultural integration and administrative adaptation, as the Mongol rulers who governed these territories gradually adopted many of the sophisticated governmental practices artistic traditions, and intellectual achievements of the Persian civilization while simultaneously preserving the military effectiveness, administrative efficiency, and religious tolerance that had been characteristic features of Mongol rule throughout the empire, creating a unique synthesis of cultural influences that enriched both traditions and produced remarkable achievements in literature, art, architecture, science, and scholarship that would influence cultural development throughout the region for many centuries to come. The Yuan dynasty that was established in China followed a similar pattern of gradual cultural integration and administrative adaptation. As Mongol rulers learned to work effectively within the sophisticated governmental systems and cultural traditions that had been developed over many centuries of Chinese civilization while also introducing innovations and improvements that drew upon their own experience and the knowledge they had gained from governing other parts of their vast empire, creating a period of remarkable prosperity, cultural achievement, and international exchange that demonstrated the benefits that could result from the peaceful combination of different governmental and cultural traditions. The Golden Horde that controlled the western regions of the empire, including much of what is now Russia and Eastern Europe, developed its own distinctive characteristics through a similar process of gradual adaptation and cultural integration. As Mongol administrative practices and military traditions were combined with local customs and governmental systems to create effective regional governance that maintained the essential features of imperial unity while responding to the particular conditions and needs of populations that had their own long-established traditions and expectations about the proper relationship between rulers and subjects, creating stable and prosperous conditions that supported economic development, cultural activities, and peaceful international relations. The Chagatai Khanate that governed much of Central Asia represented another successful example of this peaceful evolution from centralized imperial administration to regional autonomy within a framework of continued cooperation and mutual support. As the territories that had been among the first to be incorporated into the Mongol Empire gradually developed their own administrative institutions and cultural characteristics while maintaining the trade networks, communication systems, and diplomatic relationships that had been established during the period of unified imperial rule and that continued to provide benefits for all the participating regions and populations. The process by which these regional governments gradually assumed greater autonomy and independence was managed through careful negotiation and mutual agreement rather than through conflict or rebellion, as all parties recognized that the benefits of continued cooperation and coordination far outweighed any advantages that might be gained through complete separation or hostile competition that could damage the trade networks, cultural exchanges, and security arrangements that had been developed during the period of unified rule and that continued to serve the interests of all the successor states and their populations. The administrative institutions that had been developed during the period of unified imperial rule provided valuable foundations for the governmental systems of the successor states, as experienced officials and established procedures could be adapted to serve regional needs while maintaining the efficiency and effectiveness that had made Mongol administration so successful throughout the empire, ensuring continuity of governmental services and preserving the knowledge and expertise that had been accumulated through decades of practical experience in governing diverse populations across vast territories with different languages, customs, and economic systems. The legal frameworks that had been established through the Yasa and its various supplements and modifications continued to influence legal development in all the successor states, providing common principles and procedures that facilitated cooperation and coordination between different regions, while allowing for appropriate adaptations and modifications that reflected local customs and conditions. creating a shared legal heritage that supported peaceful relations and mutual understanding between the various political entities that emerged from the gradual transformation of the unified empire. The economic relationships and trade networks that had been developed during the period of imperial unity continued to function effectively even as political authority became more decentralized and regionalized, demonstrating the strength and value of the commercial institutions and practices that had been established to support international exchange and economic cooperation, while also showing how economic interdependence could provide strong incentives for maintaining peaceful relationships and resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than military confrontation that might damage the prosperity and security that benefited all participating regions and populations. The cultural exchanges and intellectual cooperation that had flourished during the period of unified rule continued to enrich all the successor states, as scholars, artists, craftsmen, and religious teachers maintained the networks of communication and collaboration that had been established during the imperial period, creating ongoing opportunities for learning, innovation, and cultural development that transcended political boundaries and contributed to the continued advancement of human knowledge and creative achievement throughout all the regions that had been part of the great empire. The diplomatic relationships and international cooperation that had been developed between the Mongol Empire and other political entities provided valuable precedents and frameworks for managing relationships between the successor states and their neighbors, as experienced diplomats and established procedures could be adapted to serve the needs of regional governments while maintaining the peaceful and cooperative approaches to international relations that had been characteristic features of Mongol diplomacy. During the period of imperial expansion and consolidation, the military traditions and defensive capabilities that had been developed during the period of imperial rule were preserved and adapted by the successor states to meet their own security needs, while maintaining the cooperative relationships and mutual support arrangements that had been established during the unified period, ensuring that regional autonomy did not lead to increased vulnerability or the kind of military conflicts that might damage the peace and prosperity that had been achieved through decades of effective imperial governance and peaceful international relations. The technological innovations and scientific knowledge that had been accumulated and shared throughout the empire during the period of unified rule continued to benefit all the successor states, as the communication networks and cultural exchanges that had facilitated the spread of useful inventions and improved techniques remained active even as political authority became more decentralized, ensuring that the benefits of technological progress and scientific advancement continued to reach all regions and populations that had been connected through the remarkable networks of cooperation and exchange that had been established during the imperial period. The agricultural improvements and land management practices that had been developed and implemented throughout the empire provided lasting benefits for all the successor states, as the knowledge and techniques that had been used to increase food production, improve farming methods, and protect natural resources could be continued and further developed by regional governments that understood the importance of maintaining agricultural productivity and environmental sustainability as foundations for long-term prosperity and social stability. The urban planning and infrastructure development that had been accomplished during the imperial period created lasting benefits for the cities and towns throughout all the successor states, as the roads, bridges, public buildings, and other infrastructure projects that had been constructed to support imperial administration and commercial activity continued to serve regional needs while providing foundations for further development and improvement that enhanced the quality of life. For urban populations and supported continued economic growth and cultural achievement, The educational institutions and scholarly traditions that had been established and supported during the imperial period provided valuable foundations for continued intellectual development in all the successor states. As libraries, schools, and research centers continued to function under regional patronage while maintaining the networks of communication and collaboration that enabled scholars and students to share knowledge and learn from each other across political boundaries. That did not prevent the continued advancement of human learning and understanding. The religious institutions and spiritual communities that had flourished under the tolerant policies of imperial rule continued to serve the needs of diverse populations in all the successor states, while the precedents of religious tolerance and peaceful coexistence that had been established during the imperial period provided valuable guidance for regional governments that sought to maintain harmony and stability among populations that included followers of many different faiths and spiritual traditions. The healthcare systems and medical knowledge that had been developed and shared throughout the empire during the unified period continued to benefit populations in all the successor states. As physicians, healers, and medical researchers maintained the networks of communication and cooperation that enabled them to share knowledge about treatments, medicines, and health practices that improved the well-being of people throughout the regions that had been connected through the remarkable achievements of imperial administration and cultural exchange. The environmental protection and resource management policies that had been implemented during the imperial period provided valuable precedents for the successor states. As regional governments recognized the importance of maintaining the sustainable development practices that had been established to protect natural resources and preserve environmental quality for future generations, ensuring that economic development and population growth did not damage the ecological foundations that supported long-term prosperity and social stability. The craftsmanship traditions and artistic achievements that had been supported and encouraged during the imperial period continued to flourish in all the successor states. As artisans, craftsmen, and artists maintained the networks of cooperation and exchange that enabled them to share techniques, materials, and inspiration across political boundaries while developing distinctive regional styles and traditions that reflected local preferences and cultural influences within the broader framework of artistic excellence and cultural achievement that had been established during the period of unified rule. The peaceful resolution mechanisms and conflict management procedures that had been developed during the imperial period provided valuable resources for the successor states. As experienced mediators, negotiators, and legal experts could help resolve disputes and prevent conflicts between different regions and interest groups while maintaining the cooperative relationships and mutual respect that had been characteristic features of imperial governance and that continued to serve the interests of all parties involved in the ongoing process of political evolution and regional development. The communication systems and information networks that had been established during the imperial period continued to function effectively even as political authority became more decentralized, enabling the successor states to maintain coordination and cooperation in areas of mutual interest while preserving the autonomy and independence that allowed them to respond effectively to local conditions and regional needs without interference from distant authorities who might not understand particular circumstances and requirements. The financial institutions and monetary systems that had been developed during the imperial period provided stable foundations for continued economic development in all the successor states. As established banking practices, currency standards, and commercial procedures continued to facilitate trade and investment while supporting the regional economic development that enabled local populations to maintain and improve their standards of living and quality of life within them. Framework of peaceful cooperation and mutual benefit that had been established during the remarkable period of unified imperial rule. The gradual nature of this transition from unified empire to regional autonomy demonstrated the strength and durability of the institutions and practices that had been developed during the period of Mongol rule. As the benefits and achievements of imperial governance were largely preserved and continued even as political structures evolved to meet changing conditions and new challenges that required different approaches and solutions from those that had been appropriate. During the initial period of rapid expansion and empire building that had created this remarkable political and cultural achievement, the legacy of peaceful cooperation and mutual respect that had been established during the imperial period continued to influence relationships between the successor states for many centuries, as shared traditions, common experiences, and ongoing economic and cultural connections provided strong incentives for maintaining the cooperative approaches to international relations that had been characteristic features of Mongol diplomacy and that had contributed so significantly to the peace, prosperity, and cultural achievement that had been accomplished during this extraordinary period of human history. The wisdom and foresight that had been demonstrated by the Mongol leaders in creating institutions and practices that could adapt and evolve to meet changing conditions while preserving essential values and achievements provided valuable lessons for future generations of political leaders and administrators who faced their own challenges in creating effective governance for diverse populations across vast territories with different traditions, languages, and cultural preferences that required careful balance between unity and diversity, central coordination and local autonomy, stability and adaptability in the ongoing effort to create political and social institutions that could serve human needs and promote human flourishing across the enormous diversity of circumstances and conditions that characterize the complex world in which we all live and work together. The whispered echoes of the great Mongol Empire continue to resonate gently across the vast steppes and distant lands where their influence once spread like ripples across a peaceful lake, carrying with them the memory of a time when the world was connected through networks of peaceful exchange and cultural cooperation that transcended the boundaries of language, religion, and ethnicity in ways that had never been achieved before and would rarely be equaled in the centuries that followed. As the gradual fading of direct Mongol political control did not erase the profound changes and lasting improvements that had been accomplished during that remarkable period when visionary leadership, administrative genius, and cultural tolerance combined to create conditions of unprecedented prosperity, security, and intellectual development across the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The memory of Mongol achievements lived on in the stories that were told around countless fires and jairs and yurts scattered across the endless grasslands, where elderly nomads shared with their children and grandchildren the tales of the great Khan who had united all the tribes under the vast blue sky and led them to victories and conquests that had amazed the world, but more importantly had created conditions of peace and prosperity that had allowed ordinary people to live better lives, travel safely across great distances, practice their religions freely, and participate in trade and cultural exchanges that had enriched their communities and expanded their understanding of the wider world beyond their immediate experience. These stories passed down through generations of oral tradition, preserved not only the dramatic events of conquest and empire building, but also the quieter achievements of good governance, fair administration, and wise leadership that had made daily life better for millions of people throughout the territories that had come under Mongol rule, creating a legacy of positive memory that outlasted the political structures and military might that had first brought the Mongols to power and established their reputation as one of the most successful and beneficial ruling dynasties in the long history of human civilization. The trade routes that had been secured and expanded during the Mongol period continued to carry goods, ideas, and cultural influences across the vast distances that separated different regions and civilizations, maintaining the networks of economic and intellectual exchange that had been established during the height of imperial power and ensuring that the benefits of international cooperation and peaceful commerce would continue to enrich the lives of people. Throughout Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, long after the original political framework that had created these opportunities had evolved into new forms of regional governance and local administration. The administrative techniques and governmental practices that had been developed and refined during the Mongol period continued to influence political development in many regions for centuries to come. As rulers and officials recognized the practical value of the organizational methods, legal principles, and administrative procedures that had proven so effective in governing diverse populations across vast territories, leading to the adoption and adaptation of many Mongol innovations in fields ranging from taxation and law enforcement to diplomatic relations and military organization. The legal traditions that had been established through the Yasa and the accumulated body of judicial decisions and administrative rulings that had grown up around it provided valuable precedents and principles that continued to influence legal development in many regions, particularly in areas related to commercial law, property rights, religious tolerance, and the protection of travelers and merchants who depended on predictable and fair legal systems for their safety and prosperity in the challenging world of long-distance trade and cultural exchange. The cultural tolerance and religious freedom that had been characteristic features of Mongol rule created lasting precedents for peaceful coexistence between different faith communities and ethnic groups, demonstrating that political unity and administrative effectiveness did not require cultural uniformity or religious conformity, but could actually be strengthened through policies that respected diversity and encouraged the peaceful exchange of ideas and traditions between different communities within the same political framework. The technological innovations and scientific discoveries that had been facilitated and accelerated through the cultural exchanges and intellectual cooperation that flourished under Mongol rule continued to influence human development and progress long after the original imperial structure had given way to new forms of political organization. As useful inventions improved techniques and accumulated knowledge spread throughout the world and contributed to ongoing advances in agriculture, manufacturing, medicine, and many other fields that improved the quality of life for countless individuals and communities. The architectural achievements and urban planning innovations that had been accomplished during the Mongol period left lasting monuments and practical improvements that continued to serve communities for many generations, while also providing inspiration and practical models for later construction projects and city development efforts that drew upon the engineering expertise and design principles that had been developed and applied throughout the empire during its period of greatest prosperity and cultural achievement. The educational institutions and scholarly traditions that had been established and supported during the Mongol period provided foundations for continued intellectual development and learning that outlasted the political changes and administrative reorganizations that marked the transition from unified empire to regional governance, ensuring that the accumulated knowledge and educational practices that had been developed during the imperial period would continue to benefit students and scholars in all the regions that had been connected through the remarkable networks of cultural exchange and intellectual cooperation. The artistic traditions and creative achievements that had flourished under Mongol patronage and encouragement continued to enrich the cultural life of many regions long after the original imperial support had ended. As artists, craftsmen, and cultural workers maintained the networks of cooperation and exchange that enabled them to share techniques, materials, and inspiration across political boundaries while developing new forms of artistic expression that combined influences from many different cultural traditions within innovative syntheses that reflected the cosmopolitan character of the world that had been created through Mongol expansion and cultural integration. The agricultural improvements and land management practices that had been developed and implemented throughout the empire provided lasting benefits that continued to support food production and rural prosperity in all the regions that had been part of the Mongol territories. As farming techniques, crop varieties, and irrigation methods that had been shared and adapted across the empire continued to enhance agricultural productivity and contribute to the economic stability and population growth that characterized many regions for centuries after the end of direct imperial administration. The diplomatic traditions and international relations practices that had been developed during the Mongol period provided valuable precedents and models for peaceful conflict resolution and cooperative relationships between different political entities, demonstrating that mutual respect, fair negotiation, and careful attention to the legitimate interests of all parties could create stable and beneficial arrangements that served the needs of diverse populations and promoted peaceful development rather than costly and destructive military conflicts. The communication systems and transportation infrastructure that had been established during the imperial period continued to facilitate trade, cultural exchange, and the movement of people and ideas long after the original political unity had evolved into new forms of regional cooperation and local governance, maintaining the connections and relationships that had been created during the period of unified rule and ensuring that the benefits of improved communication and transportation would continue to serve human needs and promote prosperity throughout the regions that had been connected through these remarkable achievements in organization and engineering. The environmental awareness and conservation practices that had been developed during the Mongol period provided early examples of sustainable development approaches that balanced human needs with environmental protection, creating precedents for responsible resource management that would become increasingly important as populations grew and technological capabilities expanded in ways that created new opportunities but also new risks for environmental damage and resource depletion that required careful management and long-term planning. The medical knowledge and healthcare practices that had been accumulated and shared throughout the empire during the period of unified rule continued to benefit populations in all the successor regions. As physicians, healers, and medical researchers maintained the networks of communication and cooperation that enabled them to build upon the medical advances and health improvements that had been achieved through the cultural exchanges and intellectual collaboration that had characterized the Mongol period. The peaceful transition processes that had been developed to manage the evolution from unified empire to regional autonomy provided valuable models for political change and governmental adaptation that demonstrated how major transformations in political structure could be accomplished without destroying valuable institutions and beneficial practices, showing that stability and continuity could be preserved even during periods of significant change when careful planning, mutual respect, and commitment to shared values guided the transition process. The spiritual and philosophical influences that had been shared and developed during the period of Mongol rule continued to enrich the religious and intellectual life of many communities long after the end of the original imperial framework, as the traditions of tolerance, dialogue, and peaceful coexistence that had been established during the imperial period provided foundations for continued cooperation and mutual understanding between different faith communities and philosophical traditions. The economic innovations and commercial practices that had been developed to support trade and prosperity throughout the empire continued to influence business and economic development in many regions for centuries to come. as merchants, bankers, and other commercial professionals built upon the financial institutions. Trading practices and commercial relationships that had been established during the period of imperial unity and expansion. The social reforms and administrative innovations that had been implemented to improve the lives of ordinary people throughout the empire created lasting improvements in social conditions and governmental services that continued to benefit populations long after the original imperial administration had given way to new forms of regional and local governance, demonstrating that the true measure of political success lay not in military conquest or territorial expansion, but in the ability to create conditions that improved the daily lives and long-term prospects of the people who lived under governmental authority. The historical documentation and scholarly records that had been maintained throughout the empire during its period of greatest achievement provided valuable resources for later historians, administrators, and political leaders who sought to understand and learn from this remarkable period of effective governance and cultural development, ensuring that the lessons and achievements of Mongol rule would not be forgotten but would continue to inform and inspire efforts to create beneficial institutions and practices for future generations. The cultural synthesis and intellectual integration that had been accomplished during the Mongol period created new forms of knowledge and understanding that combined the wisdom and expertise of many different civilizations in ways that advanced human learning and capability far beyond what any single culture could have achieved in isolation, demonstrating the enormous benefits that could result from peaceful cooperation and cultural exchange when conducted within frameworks that respected diversity while promoting unity of purpose and mutual benefit. The peaceful memory of this extraordinary period in human history continued to inspire hope and provide guidance for later generations who faced their own challenges in creating political institutions and social arrangements that could serve human needs while respecting cultural differences and promoting prosperity and security for diverse populations living together within shared political frameworks that required careful balance between competing interests and different approaches to the fundamental questions of governance and social organization. The gentle winds that blow across the steppes today still carry whispers of the great empire that once united much of the known world under a single authority that demonstrated how effective governance, cultural tolerance, and administrative competence could create conditions of unprecedented peace and prosperity for millions of people whose lives were improved through the vision and leadership of remarkable individuals who understood that true greatness lay not in destruction and domination, but in construction and cooperation that served the long-term interests of all humanity. As we come to the end of our peaceful journey through the remarkable history of the Mongol Empire, we can rest peacefully knowing that this extraordinary achievement in human governance and cultural development demonstrated that people from different backgrounds and traditions can work together successfully when they are united by shared values of fairness, respect, and commitment to the common good, creating institutions and practices that serve human needs while preserving the diversity and creativity that make life rich and meaningful for individuals and communities throughout the world. The legacy of the Mongol Empire reminds us that lasting achievements in human civilization come not from conflict and competition, but from cooperation and mutual understanding. From the patient work of building institutions that serve human needs and promote human flourishing, and from the wisdom to recognize that our shared humanity is more important than the differences that sometimes divide us, but which can also enrich our lives when they are celebrated and preserved within frameworks of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence. The quiet steppes that once witnessed the rise of this great empire now provide peaceful grazing for the herds that continue to follow the ancient rhythms of nomadic life, while the cities and towns that once flourished under Mongol rule continue to serve the needs of their populations, maintaining the traditions of tolerance, cooperation and cultural exchange that were among the greatest achievements of this remarkable period in human history, when visionary leadership and practical wisdom combined to create benefits that continue to enrich our world today. In the gentle silence of this vast landscape, where the grass waves softly in the eternal wind and the sky stretches endlessly above, we can find peace in the knowledge that human beings are capable of great achievements when they work together with wisdom, courage and commitment to the values that unite us all in our shared journey through life on this beautiful planet that provides for all our needs when we care for it with the same wisdom and foresight that characterize the greatest leaders and most beneficial institutions that our species has ever created. The story of the Mongol Empire, told here in whispers across the quiet grasslands where it all began, offers us hope and inspiration for our own efforts to create a world of peace, prosperity, and mutual understanding, where all people can live together in harmony while celebrating the diversity and creativity that make our shared human experience so rich and meaningful, reminding us that the greatest victories are achieved not through conquest but through the patient work of building bridges between different communities and cultures that enable us all to benefit from the wisdom, knowledge, and creative achievements that each group brings to our common human heritage. So let us rest now in the peaceful knowledge that this remarkable story of human achievement continues in our own time through our own efforts to create institutions and relationships that serve the needs of all people while respecting the differences that make each community unique and valuable. Knowing that the gentle winds that blow across these ancient grasslands carry with them the eternal hope that human beings can overcome their differences and work together to create a world worthy of our highest aspirations and deepest dreams for peace, prosperity, and mutual understanding among all the peoples of the earth. Sweet dreams, dear listener, as you drift off to sleep with these gentle echoes of history flowing softly through your mind, carrying you peacefully into the realm of rest where the greatest achievements of human civilization become part of your own peaceful dreams of what is possible when people work together with wisdom, courage, and love for the common good that unites us all beneath the vast and eternal sky that has watched over countless generations of human hopes and dreams and will continue to bless our efforts to create a better world for all who come after us in the endless story of human progress and peaceful cooperation that makes life meaningful and beautiful for everyone who participates in this great adventure of civilization and culture that we all share together.